Good morning. We'll go ahead and call the committee to order. Thank you all for being here this morning. We have a full committee hearing on the Department of the Air Force fiscal year 2023 budget request, part of our ongoing posture hearings as we take a look at the President's budget and prepare for how we want to handle it for the process for the rest of this year. We are joined by the Honorable Frank Kendall, who is the Secretary for the United States Air Force, General Charles Brown, Chief of Staff for the United States Air Force, and General John Raymond, who is the Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. Thank you, gentlemen, all for being here. And this is a very interesting time as we try to figure out how to meet our national security needs at the moment, and at the same time prepare for a rapidly changing future. And I think that's the main theme of this hearing. Both within the Space Force and within the Air Force, you have a fairly complicated set of plans to figure out what platforms you're going to need to meet the missions that you're being asked to do. On the Air Force side, we are juggling a variety of different systems to try to figure out how to get to the appropriate number of air wings, what to do with the F-35 as we continue to await the delivery of the Block 4, the capability that we really want, while at the same time dealing with legacy aircraft systems like the A-10 and the F-22. So General Brown and Secretary Kendall, we're most interested to hear sort of what's the vision of how that plays out. I know those plans have changed quite a bit from year to year as situation has evolved, costs has evolved, and as we've learned more about what we're going to need going forward. It'd be good to get sort of a quick summary of where you're at now today and your confidence level, both in what the plan is and our ability to implement it in terms of funding and also in terms of building those capabilities. And I think the thing that has changed the most, which is a continuing theme for this committee, is how survivability and weapon systems have really changed. And we're certainly seeing that in the fight in Ukraine. Missiles and drones and information systems have changed everything. Platforms are not as survivable as they used to be, and we need to figure out how they can operate within hostile environments and how we can build better platforms that can operate within those hostile environments. If a swarm of relatively low-cost drones can deliver a better punch and is more survivable in an environment than an incredibly expensive airplane, how does that change our plans going forward in terms of what we need? Because I think as we look at the fight in Ukraine again right now, the number one biggest thing that we all wish we had more of is missiles, and number two is drones. So how does that factor into our plans? And then, of course, long-range fires are a huge part of survivability as well. Being able to hit the enemy from a greater distance than they can hit you matters enormously. How does that fit into those plans going forward? There are some similar challenges within the Space Force. I mean, certainly the information systems space is absolutely key to that. The ability to gather the information we need and distribute it to the people who need it when they need it, and to make sure we can protect it. That is increasingly important on the battlefield these days, and also more and more challenging to make sure that those systems are survivable as we need to upgrade that. So very curious to see how all of the systems are being upgraded to make sure that they meet those requirements. Then, of course, the other huge thing in space is we're planning on launching a lot of satellites in the next 20 years. Part of how we want to develop that survivable infrastructure, that survivable information system infrastructure, is to have more redundancy. Instead of relying on a few exquisite platforms, have more spread out that are more survivable and more redundant. But to get there, that's a lot of work in terms of building the satellites, launching them, maintaining them. Curious to see how that fits within the budget. And we do have to figure out how to fit within the budget. I know there will be a lot of discussion today about whether or not you have enough money. Does anybody, other than Elon Musk, that is, ever really have enough money? I'm interested in that, certainly. Inflation, supply chain, these issues are complicating everything that I just said and everything that you're trying to do. We are curious to know how you're looking at handling those issues. But also, whatever you got to spend it well. And it's just been my experience throughout life that you can give somebody 10 times as much money, but if the person with 1/10 the money spends it better, they're going to win. So how do you make sure that you're spending the money in an efficient and effective way to deliver what you're trying to get? So curious about all of those issues. With that, I will yield to Mr. Rogers for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for their service to our country and for their preparation and attendance today. I do remain extremely concerned about President Biden's budget proposal. The budget request does not keep pace with the threats we're facing from China or Russia, and it does not keep pace with the historic levels of inflation we're currently experiencing. Inflation is eating into the buying power of the department and impacting the livelihoods of our service members and their families, and it's not going down anytime soon. We're going to be dealing with this problem well into FY23 and beyond, but the budget request doesn't account for it. General Milley testified to that fact last month. This means nearly every dollar of increase this budget has is eaten up by inflation. Very little, if anything, will be left over to modernize or grow capacity. That forces our service chiefs to make unnecessary choices about the requirements to fund, which requirements to fund and which to defer. The $5.2 billion unfunded priorities submitted by General Brown and General Raymond are a testament to that fact. Priorities such as F-35s, hypersonic weapons, missile warning and tracking, and the critical weapons and facility sustainment all went underfunded in this budget. These are exactly the priorities we should be funding. The budget continues the Air Force's strategy to divest capabilities that aren't survivable in a fight against China and use the savings to invest in advanced technologies capable of prevailing in that conflict. While I support that approach, we should ask tough questions about how much risk we're absorbing and for how long. Many of the divestments in this year's budget would undermine the service's ability to continue to meet critical requirements until the next decade. That's because replacements are still early in the development process while delivery timelines continue to move to the right. To make matters worse, the budget cuts the buy for many capabilities we need to bridge the gap. It means the administration is gambling that China, Russia, or some other adversary won't force us into conflict before 2030. Given the atrocities we're witnessing in Ukraine, that's a dangerous bet. Divest to invest is important, but it can't leave our combatant commanders trying to fill near-term requirements with empty toolbox. Finally, I'm glad to see the increased investments proposed by the Space Force. We must continue to push forward with distributed architecture in space in a smart way that provides capabilities to the warfighters now while accelerating future systems. I also want to highlight that General Raymond's request to make it easier to move Guardians between active and reserve status is a great move. This is exactly the type of innovative approach to warfighting that we envisioned when we created the Space Force. I know there are several issues to work through on this proposal, but I look forward to seeing it happen. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Secretary Kendall, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, members of the committee. I'm honored to have General Brown and General Raymond join me in representing the nearly 700,000 airmen and guardians that defend our nation. We're all thankful for your consistent support over the years. Speaking in 1940, General Douglas MacArthur said the following: "The history of failure in war can almost be summed up in two words: too late. Too late in comprehending the deadly purpose of a potential enemy, too late in realizing the mortal danger, too late in preparedness, too late in uniting all possible forces for resistance, and too late in standing with one's friends." I believe MacArthur made this comment after France fell to Nazi aggression, but before the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into a war in Asia, a time that in some ways may be analogous to today. What my colleagues and I are trying to do, what we need your help with, is to ensure that American air and space forces are never too late in meeting our pacing challenge, which is China. We're also concerned about the now obvious and acute threat of Russian aggression. Many of you have heard the China threat briefing that we presented. It lays out China's efforts to develop and field forces that could defeat our ability to project power in the Western Pacific. Today, we'll say more about how the Department of the Air Force is responding to that threat through our fiscal year 23 budget and through future budgets. Our budget submission provides a balance between the capabilities we need today and investments in transformation required to address emerging threats. With the requested budget, the Air and Space Forces will be able to support our combatant commanders in the continuing campaigns that demonstrate our resolve and support and encourage our allies and partners around the world. Simultaneously, our fiscal year 23 budget represents a significant early step in the transformation of the Air and Space Forces to the capabilities needed to provide enduring advantage. An important feature of our budget request is a substantial increase in research and development funding. This investment is a down payment on production and sustainment investments and hard choices that are to come. We're comfortable with the balance struck in this budget submission, but we also want to ensure the committee understands that hard choices do lie ahead at any budget level. In this request, we're asking for divestiture of equipment that is beyond its service life, too expensive to sustain, or not effective against the pacing challenge. These divestitures are necessary to provide the resources required to transform the Department of the Air Force to support integrated deterrence. We appreciate the committee's support for the divestitures we requested last year, and we ask for your support this year and in the future. Change is hard, but losing is unacceptable, and we cannot afford to be too late. The work we have ongoing in the Department of the Air Force to define the necessary transformation is focused on 7 operational imperatives, each of which is associated with some aspect of our ability to project power. As of today, there should be no doubt that great power acts of aggression do occur, and equally no doubt of how devastating they can be for the victims of that aggression. First, if the Space Force is to fulfill its mission of both enabling and protecting the joint force, we must pivot to transformational space architectures and systems. In fiscal year 23, we're asking for funding to begin the transformation to resilient missile warning and tracking and resilient communications networks. Second, we must integrate and efficiently employ air and space forces as part of a highly lethal joint force through an advanced battle management system, or ABMS. This budget continues funding for early increments of ABMS and the ongoing work that will define additional investments that the Department needs to cost-effectively modernize our command control, communications, and battle management networks. Third, to defeat aggression, we must have the ability to hold large numbers of air and surface targets at risk in a time-compressed scenario. This budget funds the E-7 Wedgetail as an interim AWACS replacement, while supporting work to define the transformation to a resilient combination of air and space intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance systems. Fourth, our control of the air is being challenged, and we must proceed to an affordable next-generation air dominance family of systems. The budget increases funding for the NGAD family of systems to include a 6th-generation crewed platform and uncrewed, unmanned combat aircraft. Fifth, we must have resilient forward basing for our tactical forces. This budget continues funding for agile combat employment in both the Indo-Pacific and European regions, while we define the most cost-effective mix of hardening, active defense, deception, and dispersion activities. Sixth, we must ensure the long-term viability and cost-effectiveness of our global strike capability. This budget begins the transition of the B-21 from development to production, and it continues the work to define a more extensive global strike family of systems that also includes uncrewed combat aircraft. Finally, the Department of the Air Force must be fully ready to transition to a wartime posture against a peer competitor. In particular, we must strengthen our cybersecurity and our resilience against attacks on the information systems and facilities that we depend upon to go to war. Members of the committee, I look forward to your support as we work to ensure that America's air and space forces are never too late. One team, one fight. We welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Brown.
Good morning, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you and represent the 689,000 total force airmen serving today. Thank you for your continued support to our airmen and their families. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with Secretary Kendall and General Raymond to testify on the FY23 budget submission, a budget that continues to accelerate the Air Force's rate of change to address the national security challenges articulated in the National Defense Strategy, a budget that continues to build on the successes of FY22. The world looks to the United States Air Force as a leading example. Our airmen make air power look easy. It's anything but. A world-class Air Force requires world-class airmen that are organized, trained, and equipped to remain the world's most respected Air Force. But if we do not continue to transform, this may no longer be the case. We must continue to communicate and collaborate with this committee and key stakeholders so we can accelerate change. Last year's budget communicated the Air Force the nation needs for 2030 and beyond. Our message has not changed for fiscal year 23, and it won't change in future budget submissions. We must modernize to counter strategic competitors. The People's Republic of China remains our pacing challenge, and Russia remains an acute threat. So we must balance between the demands of today and the requirements of tomorrow. Failure to do so puts our ability to execute the national defense strategy at risk. It puts soldiers, sailors, Marines, Guardians, Airmen, along with our allies and partners at risk. It puts our ability to place air power anytime, anywhere at risk. The only way our Air Force and nation will be successful balancing risk between today and tomorrow is if we collaborate. In fact, collaboration is the critical word in Accelerate, Change, or Lose. We're beginning to see the success of our collaboration efforts transitioning to the future. This year's budget brought substantial increases to research and development, focused on placing meaningful military capability into the hands of our airmen. Investments in systems and concepts that allow our Air Force to penetrate and dominate in any scenario. Just as important in our investment efforts, we have been successful in beginning to divest systems that are increasingly irrelevant against today's and tomorrow's threats. We didn't do this alone. The support of Congress is much appreciated. Accelerating change is the impetus behind the Department of the Air Force's operational imperatives. It means moving with a sense of urgency and doing so in the right direction. This year's National Defense Strategy provides us the needed direction. And when you combine the operational imperatives and the National Defense Strategy, you see this year's budget is in alignment with our nation needs and demands of our Air Force. The Air Force we are building is critical to integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantages. Because the nuclear deterrence is the backstop of integrated deterrence, this year's budget ensures our nuclear portfolios are fully funded. Current events are emblematic of how our Air Force is campaigning. We deployed Air Force assets within days, shared vital information, and increased interoperability with our allies and partners. Finally, the Air Force is investing in enduring advantages that allow us to defend the homeland, project our power globally, and operate as a joint allied and partner force. More than anyone, I want tomorrow's airmen to be ready to respond when our nation calls. This includes investing in programs that allow all of our airmen and their families to reach their full potential. As the United States Air Force celebrates its 75th anniversary this year, we are committed to remaining the world-class Air Force America can be proud of. Current events demonstrate the world is growing more complex and uncertain. But I am certain we will need air power anytime, anywhere. I'm certain this year's budget is another step towards the transformation of our Air Force. And I am certain there's still work to be done. Therefore, we must continue to communicate and collaborate so we can accelerate change. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Raymond.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor to appear before you today with Secretary Kendall and General Brown, and I'm truly privileged to be part of this leadership team. On behalf of almost 14,000 Guardians stationed around the world, let me begin by thanking you for your continued leadership and strong support of our Guardians and their families. As we testify before you today, we find ourselves at a strategic inflection point where we are faced with an acute threat from Russia and a pacing challenge from China. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has showcased the importance of space to all instruments of power. Information derived from space, including commercial imagery, has been instrumental in dominating the information environment, communicating with forces, detecting missile threats, and sharing of information among allies and partners. It is clear that the character of war has changed, and space is foundational to that change. However, Russia's recent direct-ascent anti-satellite missile test in November is just the latest evidence of efforts to deny our nation the advantages that space provides. Just as concerning, our pacing challenge China is integrating space into their military operations to detect, track, target, and strike the joint force, putting our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians on the ground, in the air, and on the sea at high risk. We cannot allow potential adversaries to gain an unchallenged ability to conduct space-enabled attacks. Our joint forces will remain at risk until we can complete the transformation to a resilient architecture and protect the joint force from space-enabled attacks. This is critical to supporting all aspects of the National Defense Strategy, integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building an enduring advantage. To remain the world's leader in space, this President's budget request prioritizes space and invests $24.5 billion to ensure our assured access and freedom to maneuver in the domain. The largest share is research, development, testing, and evaluation funding, almost $16 billion to modernize our forces, a portion of which will begin the pivot to a more resilient and mission-capable missile warning and missile tracking force design. Notably, this includes funding for the Space Development Agency, which is included in the Space Force for the first time this year. In contrast to legacy approaches, this architecture will be built to survive and degrade gracefully under attack, help manage escalation, and be rapidly reconstituted. This transformation will allow us to capitalize more fully on two of our national advantages, our commercial industry and our allies and partners. To increase readiness, we are funding operational test and training infrastructure. This ensures that we can get the right capability on orbit in the hands of operators trained in operating in a contested domain. Robust test and training capabilities are also critical to fielding our next generation of modernized systems. Other key investments include increased funding for weapon system sustainment, a more resilient global positioning system, and next-generation satellite communications. And finally, and most importantly, we invest in our guardians and our families. Over the past 2 years, we have overhauled how we recruit, assess, train, develop, promote, employ, and take care of our guardians. Resilient space power isn't just about satellites, it's also about guardians and their families. This is one of the reasons why we are seeking the integration of the active duty and reserve forces into a single hybrid component structure. This space component is central to our human capital plan and will allow us to best align our full-time and part-time members. This is our #1 legislative proposal, and we look forward to working very closely with this committee and Congress writ large to implement this bold and transformational approach. As Secretary Kendall said in his opening comments, change is hard and losing is unacceptable. The transformation we're beginning now is essential to protecting the joint force and the security of space. Thank you again for your leadership and support for our Space Force. It's an honor to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, when it comes to the Air Force and you're trying to figure out the mix between the F-35, the F-15EX, and then, legacy programs, the A-10, F-22, as you're looking, I mean, we're very focused on the competitive fight. How do you survive in an environment going up against, what China and Russia can throw at us in terms of the air defenses and the difficulty of surviving in that environment. And then you run into platforms like the A-10, which is incredibly effective in a permissive environment. And maybe we will find a permissive environment or two along the way. Certainly that was the case in Iraq and Afghanistan. When you're looking at those plans, to me, that's one of the most confusing aspects of how do you balance that? You can look at a fight and say, if it's a permissive environment, this is what I want. If it's not, this is what I want. How do you balance that, and how has that informed your plans for what air platforms you want? This applies to tankers and bombers as well. How are you balancing that and figuring out what your plan is for the next decade and beyond?
That's a great question. It's an important question. General Brown will have some comments about this also. He's talked about the fighter mix in the past. We do need a mix of capabilities because we're supporting combatant commanders from around the world for a variety of missions, and there's constant demand for air assets everywhere that there are American forces and American interests. Because of that, we maintain a mix which traditionally was kind of a high-low mix, more expensive aircraft that more capable for the more higher requirements, and then a lower cost part of the force that allowed us to give us more quantity and more capabilities overall. That balance traditionally has served us fairly well. What I observe as Secretary is that what we have currently in the pipeline and that will populate our future force tends to be all high-cost, higher-end capabilities. And you look at NGAD, the newest system under development, it's quite expensive. If you look at F-22, it was a fairly expensive aircraft. That's the one that NGAD's replacing. F-35 was intended to be at one time kind of the low end of a high-low mix, but it's an $80 million copy aircraft. It's really expensive. So then the rest of the force is filled out with legacy aircraft we've already acquired to a large extent. So when I look at all of that, and F-15EX is now in the mix too, which has unique reasons why it's in the mix that make good sense, but it's fairly expensive also, partly because of the quantities we're buying, but it's just a more expensive airplane. So basically, we need a more affordable mix for the future, and the question is, how do we get there? And that's one of the reasons I'm introducing the idea of uncrewed combat aircraft that are much less expensive and can be attritable, not necessarily expendable. They're not munitions, but they can be used up at a higher rate and help populate our force structure. Now, that's a ways away. That's quite a few ways out. So in the meantime, we've got to maintain the mix that General Brown has talked about, which is a combination of the F-35, the F-15EX, the F-22, and the F-16. So we're going to be evolving towards a new set of capabilities in the future, but I am very much driven by both affordability requirements and mission requirements as we try to build that capability. I'll let General Brown talk about the mix from an operational perspective.
Yeah, Chairman, we get to this our approach based on analysis, wargaming, and experience, and in a conversation with our combatant commanders as well. As Secretary Kendall described, it is a mix of capability that we need to be able to have, multi-role capability, because you don't know if you're going to be in a permissive or non-permissive, and I would expect more non-permissive environments in the future. So we got to have that capability. The A-10 is a great platform for in a non-permissive environment. I don't see very many non-permissive environments that we're going to roll into here in the future. And this is why we're focused on, the F-35 is a cornerstone of our fleet, and continue to get it upgraded to get to TR-3 and Block 4, so it provides us the capability against a very advancing threat from the PRC. F-15EX, which actually is in the E model, more of a weapons truck that can carry some high-end weapons. Some of the weapons we are developing, like hypersonic missiles that can fit on a fighter. We'll also have the upgrade the F-22 as it transitions and eventually becomes the NGAD will replace the F-22, and then the F-16, which will be our low end. And we still have a number of the post-block or newer block F-16s that we'll keep for a period of time. So that's the mix of capability that we'll have for a fighter. And we do the same thing not only in the aircraft, but it's also got to be the mix of munitions that go with it and the other support aspects of missions that go with that fighter mix.
That's a very important point. And I think I meant a little misleading in my question mentioning China and Russia, but the truth is what's developing when you, as you said, there aren't going to be too many non-permissive environments because you don't have to be a China or Russia these days, as we're witnessing again in Ukraine. A small country, relatively small military, can still have air defense systems that will defeat even the most high-end aircraft. So we're going to have to be prepared to operate in far less permissive environments than we have over the course of the last couple of decades, and that requires a huge mindset shift in terms of what we're going to build. Just a quick question for General Raymond on the satellite architecture. We've really had a massive evolution from 20 years ago when we had United Launch Alliances, so we could only afford to have one provider because no one else, there wasn't enough to go around to create competition. Sorry, that didn't make a lot of sense. That you didn't have enough stuff that you were going to buy, so one company was all that could be there, and now it's just proliferating. All manner of different companies are developing both the ability to build satellites and to launch them. So how do you see, once we get through the phase 2 purchases, where do we go in order to make sure we create that competition, but also it's not spread so thin that companies don't see, a possibility of really, making it work economically when they're selling those launch capabilities? How do you balance that in the next couple of decades?
It's a really good question. We are at a really transformation point in space. We go back to 3 tenets on our launch strategy. It's been to have assured access to space, and that gets to your point about not spreading them too thin. We want to make sure that we've got capability, but we've got the right capability to put things in orbit. The second part of our strategy was to promote competition. And so I think there's opportunities here with a manifest that's becoming more significant in numbers, that there's room for increased competition. The third area was to get off the RD-180 engine, and we've bought all the RD-180 engines that we need. In fact, it's less than what Congress allowed us to do, and I'm very comfortable in a good position on that front. I think one of the big changes that we've seen, though, in these smaller constellations that are launched, in the past, historically, a rocket would put 1 satellite up or 2 satellites up. What we're seeing now is a rocket putting 80 satellites up, if you will, at a time. And so all that goes into account as we look forward to what a phase 3 would look like.
Well, and just put a quick plug in for competition, because I very much believe in that. I think we have a huge opportunity in space that there are so many companies, certainly the big ones that we've heard about, SpaceX, Blue Origin, others, but then, gosh, probably a dozen others that are smaller. And if we can encourage that competition, I think we can get a better product for a better price. So I want to make sure we do that. Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Raymond, you and I and General Hyten have talked for years about how overclassified our space systems are. And he's gone now, but you're still there. I know you've been working at trying to get some of this declassified. How's that going?
He's gone, I'm still here, and so is our problem. We're working it. And we have made some progress. We've restructured what I've learned over the years, not only were we overly classified, we were overly classified in kind of a non-normal way. So we've tried to normalize that. We have reduced classification on some programs. For example, our GMTI program from space, which was higher classification, we reduced it so we could work with our partners in industry better. There's a task that came out of the National Defense Authorization Act this past year that was tasked to the Secretary of Defense to do a review of all security classification of all space programs. Assistant Secretary John Plum, Dr. Plum, is working that, and we're integrated with him. There's more work to do, but we've got the right focus on it, and I'm convinced that we're going to make some progress.
Well, it's important. You know, the fact is the American public still doesn't really know what Space Force is about, and it's about satellites, as you know, and it's just incredibly overclassified. We've got to get that information out, not just for the public, but for our adversaries. I think they need to know what we can do in a more open way. And it's for you and General Brown, you know, in FY22, we increased your budget by 6%, and as you know, inflation was at over 8%. How are y'all dealing with that? Give us some examples about what it means to you to have inflation that's greater than the increase in your budget.
Ranking Member Rogers, you know, as we built the budget and not really having a good full understanding where the inflation numbers were going to be, what we'll have to do as we go back into our budget is look at more detail and figure out where the areas that we're going to need to plus up in certain areas or make some choices internal to the Air Force, and then at the same time working inside the department of how we articulate what the impact is from an inflation standpoint on the key areas, because inflation impacts different parts of the force in different ways, and so it'll be some ongoing analysis we'll have to do.
I agree. I'll tell you though, as I said in my opening statement, the department prioritized space in this budget pretty significantly. We have a pretty significant increase to be able to do the critical work that we're doing. It's going to have to be a balance, and we're going to have to work with Congress throughout the year to make sure that we can do it right.
Well, I make that point because, you know, same thing's happening this year. As you have all seen, that SecDef and the chairman testified before this committee acknowledging that the 2.2% that's cooked into this budget proposal is not adequate, and they're going to have to revisit that, which means you're going to have to revisit that as this year progresses, and we try to fashion what the top line is going to be. So I do hope you'll be giving some thought to what you need to make sure that you can meet your requirements to deal with current threats as well as the modernization that we expect from y'all. Secretary Kendall, just a minute ago you were talking about how pricey the F-22 and the F-35 are. The last F-22 we bought cost $131 million. The F-15EX, $90 million per copy. F-35 between $90 and $100 million. What can we do to get those costs down? I mean, this is incredible numbers. You said $80 million a copy for F-35. It'd be nice if it was $80 million. What can we do to get this down?
Ranking members, you know I spend a lot of my time working in the acquisition side of the defense business, and a great deal of that effort was spent on trying to get costs down. We drove the cost of the F-35 down substantially over as it was in development, transitioning into production. We need to continue to do that. Sustainment offers an opportunity for additional cost reductions, and it's important to keep in mind that that's at least half the cost of our weapon systems is in sustainment side. But the key to keeping costs under control starts with requirements. What are you buying? If you put a lot of capability and sophistication into an aircraft, it's going to be more expensive, and that's exactly what we did with the F-35.
So it's been a moving target. Requirements have been.
Requirements have evolved as the threat has changed, but requirements need to be something that you trade off against cost early in a program and then continuously as you go forward. It requires tight cooperation between developers and operators to ensure that we don't just set a rigid set of requirements initially and then spend until we get there. That's not the right way to do it. And I mentioned the operational imperatives earlier. Each of those operational imperatives is led by a combination of an acquisition person or a technical person and an operator And it's because we have to have that dialogue between those two communities to get to what's reasonable and affordable as part of the mix. It also meets operators' needs, but isn't gold-plated. So I think we're getting, at the end of the day, a very capable aircraft in the F-35. I think we're going to get an aircraft that meets mission needs, the unique mission needs of the F-15EX. I'm watching the Next Generation Air Dominance platform, which I put in motion when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition, very carefully to see if we can keep the cost of that down. As the F-22 replacement, it's going to be a very capable aircraft. It's going to be the one that gives us air superiority in the future. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm introducing a mix of uncrewed capabilities as well, which should be much less expensive than the NGAD platform itself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes, and he is on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we got you loud and clear. Go ahead, Jim.
Very good. Okay, thank you very much, Chairman, and I want to thank our witness for their testimony today. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, let me start with you. You know, we talked this morning about how much we've invested in and we're dependent on our overhead architecture because it advanced technological capabilities. But with that comes real vulnerabilities. And one of the things I'm really concerned about is that the Air Force's Link 16 crypto modernization effort is behind. It's impacting readiness and safety. I'm not happy about this delay. What is the current status of the effort, and when will it be complete? And what are the barriers to a faster timeline, and what can be done to accelerate it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how much I can say in an open session about it. We have been addressing the crypto mod requirements for Link 16 and became aware of it a few months ago and took steps immediately to put the resources on it that were necessary to get us where we need to be. As we've gone through the last 20 years of being focused on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency campaigns where there wasn't a sophisticated threat to our data links, that's been neglected, quite frankly. So we had to put resources against it. The lead time is basically we're replacing radios, so we have to buy the radios. So there is some lead time associated with that. But it's a problem we're well aware of. That isn't the only concern we have with Link 16. We have some others that go beyond that I don't want to talk about and can't talk about in an open forum. And we really need to get to a next generation of capabilities as well. So that work is getting started also.
And with this, I'm concerned that this has been, the can's been kicked down the road a lot, and I hope that that's the end of that. We're going to actually get this done. Secretary, let me switch to this. It's my hope that in the near future, the department will continue to capitalize on additive manufacturing and be able to, for example, 3D print spare parts for our platforms. This clearly would save time, money, increase readiness, extend the usefulness of platforms for years. So how is the Air Force thinking about things like 3D printing?
There's quite a bit of effort going into that. It's a remarkable technology. I was involved in the establishment of the Additive Manufacturing Innovation Institute under the Obama administration. And in those days, we had a very small number of materials. It's several years ago, plastics initially, but we've moved to a variety of metals now. We've moved to some very complicated and sophisticated geometries. So there's huge potential there. Tinker Aerospace has done a lot of work piloting on this for maintenance, particularly for building parts for some of our older aircraft, which have been kept so long that things that people thought would never wear out are now wearing out and have to be replaced. So we're using additive manufacturing for that. It has a lot of potential from a whole bunch of different attributes. And so we're continuing that technology, and we're looking for ways to address some of the problems that we have with airworthiness certification, for example, of parts that are built that way. So it's what we're very bullish about and doing quite a bit to take advantage of.
Yeah. Good, because there should be no such thing as obsolete parts anymore. We shouldn't have to cannibalize, say, one aircraft to keep others running if we can harness the power of 3D printing. General Raymond, our military depends on many critical services that were built before we were concerned with things like cyber threats. So the capabilities our satellites provide us with are extremely important. We all know that. And the attack surface, plus the cyber breaches against them, is enormous. How is the Air Force preparing for these threats and creating a culture that integrates cyber from the ground up proactively in our future plans and acquisitions? and how would you integrate JADC2 concept into your plans and acquisition?
Thank you for the question. Space capabilities are basically a computer in space that has a link to a ground, and so it has, as you mentioned in your question, cyber vulnerability. One of the things that we've done when we established the Space Force is to enhance our cyber posture. We brought cyber operators in from the Air Force and from other services to be part of our service. We've built an 06 level command that is focused on cyber. We put detachments at every one of our other operational units. We put cyber operators embedded on the ops floor, sitting side by side with our space operators to better understand the cyber terrain. So although I will never be comfortable that we've got this solved, I'm comfortable that we've got the right focus on it, and we come to work every day making sure that we can protect and defend our space capabilities from a full range of threats, from cyber on the one end to kinetic destruction on the other.
Thank you. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. The chair now recognizes, I believe Mr. Wilson's not here, so I recognize Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning there was a story in the Colorado Springs Gazette regarding a report by the Government Accountability Office on the previous basing decision for U.S. Space Command. I requested this report last year, and this request was granted because of my ranking member position on the Readiness Subcommittee of this committee. And as was reported in this news article, and as I strongly suspected would be the case, the GAO's investigation of the Space Command basing process, quote, identified significant shortfalls in its transparency and credibility, unquote. So I'm deeply concerned that the urgency to achieve full operational capability for our space warfighters as quickly as possible was not adequately addressed in the siting decision because of a flawed process. General Raymond, I know that Space Force posture does not directly impact the basing decision for Space Command. However, I have some questions for you I hope will shed some light on the magnitude of the challenges that we are facing in space. And I know you share my concerns regarding the rapid expansion of these threats. The challenges we face in space have accelerated greatly in the last 2 or 3 years. How significantly do you anticipate the threat will grow in the next 2 to 3 years?
There's a significant threat that exists today, as I mentioned in the last answer to the last question, and it's a spectrum of threats, everything from reversible jamming to kinetic destruction. And all of our intelligence suggests that that's not going to slow down.
Space defense hinges on having accurate and relevant data. Every day, Guardians in my district work side by side with the commander of Space Command on this essential task at the National Space Defense Center. The NSDC is where Department of Defense and intelligence community experts train for and monitor threats to our space infrastructure. Would you agree that maximizing the commander's access to timely information through physical co-location of essential functions is an advantage in maintaining space superiority?
Yeah, we have the ability to command and control from various places. The U.S. Space Command actually has 2 command centers, one in Vandenberg, California, and one in Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, one in Colorado Springs. And so there's ways to do this without being physically co-located. Obviously, being co-located helps that you can go visit more routinely, but you can do it in multiple ways.
Okay. But is reduced decision time, and that comes from working side by side, and the lessening of security threats is something you would prefer as opposed to not having?
I guess I'd ask you, that's a question for General Dickinson from his U.S. Space Command hat as in the operational commander. I'm in the Space Force role. I'd organize, train, equip, and provide him capabilities. That'd be better addressed to him.
Okay. Well, we certainly will. Given the rapidly changing character of space as a warfighting domain, would your military advice generally be to accelerate our ability to defend space by any means that we have at our disposal?
I think it's important that the nation is prepared to conduct operations in space and to protect and defend those for the good of our nation, for the good of our joint and coalition forces, and for the good of the world.
To me, reaching full operational capacity for Space Command as quickly as possible should be our highest priority as a country. The threats are too serious, and the threats are not going to wait. We have no other choice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. The temporary chair now recognizes himself for a few questions. Secretary Kendall, one program that does seem like it's not too late is the B-21 program, which, again, we can't get into much details here, but I did want to ask you about a question that you and I discussed a couple weeks ago, which is that on the sustainment side, the contract that was used for the B-21, which you were involved with from your prior service in Washington, took a different approach in terms of how the software ownership and proprietary rights were going to be set up. And maybe you could just talk about that in terms of the impact that it's going to have, hopefully a positive impact in terms of the sustainment costs for that program in the future.
Sure. There are 2 points I'd make in that regard. One is that with the digitized world that we lived in, designs now are all entirely digital. And I've given guidance to our acquisition people that we should be taking delivery of our designs going forward for all of our programs. There was an era in which there was a philosophy about letting the prime contractor basically take life-to-death responsibility for a program. That was not effective. It basically put people in a sole source position forever. It didn't work out well for the government. B-21, which Dr. LaPlante, who's now the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, who was then the Air Force Acquisition Executive, and I, when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, we put in place a plan to transition software maintenance to the government. The Air Force has had some very good experience with doing this with some other programs, and it's a job that allows the government to maintain control of the technical baseline, if you will, to own the product fully as it goes forward, and to take control of how it matures from a software perspective. So we've had good experience with that, and that's the approach I think we're taking on the B-21.
Yeah, it may seem like a pretty sort of arcane point, but we've had numerous hearings with GAOs weighing in terms of how the software was handled for F-35, and it really has been, I think, a big, according to the GAO, factor in terms of driving up the cost of sustainment. So again, it's one of those programs which it's part of the recapitalization of the triad, as well as having a conventional mission. So time is of the essence, and it looks like, again, it's not going to be too late. So hopefully we'll all keep working together in terms of making sure of that. Mr. Lamborn talked about the decision in terms of the Space Force headquarters. There was another decision that was made in the last year or so regarding the C-130J basing decisions, which as some of us recall, actually a decision was made before, which preceded appropriation for, that facility, and that certainly left some of us a bad taste in our mouth in terms of just how that was managed. We're now back in, there was no GAO report, but I think, that, honestly, the facts sort of speak for themselves. We're now back in a new round of C-130J basing, and I would simply ask you and maybe General Brown just to assure us that there will be full open communication and transparency during this upcoming selection process, because again, I think that is critical to, I think, the confidence of this committee and the Congress in general.
I want to assure you that our strategic basing process, or whatever process we use to make basing decisions, sometimes we do it through the budget process, basically, will be clear, open, transparent, and apolitical. If there's one thing I've learned in my experience in this position so far, it's the extreme concern that people like yourself have for basing decisions. And I want to be able to present all of our basing decisions in a way which you can fully understand them and understand what the basis was for them. You may not agree with it, but you'll understand that it was set up to be in the interest of the nation and in the best interest of the Department of the Air Force, and that was what was behind any decision that we made.
Great, I appreciate that. General, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Well, it ends up being a secretary's decision, but what I focus on is ensuring that when we look at from a mission perspective, we're able to one, do the mission, but at the same time, the support to the mission, but also to our airmen and families that come into those communities as well. But we'll be very open and transparent with you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Secretary Kendall, I want to begin with you. Last year you said, if it doesn't threaten China, why are we doing it? I couldn't agree more. We had that conversation the other day. You also said, in your words, that you're focused on the shortest path possible to a better generation of actual fielded capability. Last year, General Brown, you acknowledged, again in your words, by saying China continues to move its modernization timelines left at a rate of change that is outpacing the United States. This year's budget submission from the Air Force over the next 5 years retires 646 aircraft and builds 246 aircraft. That's a deficit of 400 aircraft. And I understand NGAD and modernization and all the things that we want our aircraft to do, unmanned platforms, but 400 is one heck of a big vulnerability, capacity, and capability gap that, in light of your words about the things that scare China or the things that we need to move our efforts to the left because we're being outpaced by China, just doesn't seem to add up. Can you give me your perspective on what operational risk you think that we will be facing in the next 5 years as we spin down 646 aircraft and build back 246?
Appreciate the question. There is operational risk, and this is something that when I talk about balancing risk over time, there's a balance between the operational risk we will see today as we make that transition versus the risk we will have in the future if we don't start to modernize. And this is a conversation that I have internally with the Air Force. It's a conversation I have with our combatant commanders and naturally with this committee and others. We do have to make some tough choices. I also look at not just the numbers, but I look at the overall capability and capacity, not just the airplanes, but what goes with the airplanes, as I mentioned earlier, whether it be the weapons, our trained airmen, the support systems that go with. And so it's a complete package. But I agree, there is some risk there. But I'd rather take a little bit of risk now than a lot of risk later in a future conflict.
Gotcha. Let me ask this to both Secretary Kendall and General Brown. What investments do you support that would accelerate these modernization timelines, that would, however you term it, buy back some of that risk or reduce that risk over time?
I was thinking as you spoke earlier, Congressman, about China and their relative performance compared to ours. I've looked at the data on this. Their engineers are not faster than our engineers. Their lead time to field any given capability is comparable to our own. But what they have done that we have not probably done enough of is start a lot of new things and then take them through to fielding. When I look at the scale and the breadth of what they're doing to modernize, they seem to be very open to integrating new technologies and integrating them and using them in creative ways. We've got to be more forthcoming about that sort of thing. So that requires some cultural changes, if you will. Acceptance of uncrewed combat aircraft, for example. We have to actually do what we talk about in programs like JADC² and ABMS and get to real capability. When I look at what we've done, particularly over the last few years, we've done programs that were designed to go fast, but they weren't necessarily going in the right direction, and they didn't necessarily get to the place you want to get to. It's the hare and the tortoise problem. Going quickly to do a demonstration doesn't get you very far down the road to a real fielded production-ready capability. So I've asked our acquisition people to look at all those programs and make sure they're structured to, and my guidance is to get meaningful military capability, not just one or two or something, but meaningful military capability as quickly as possible. At the end of the day, that's going to be about resources. Production is much more expensive than R&D, and sustainment is comparable to production. So at the end of the day, we're going to need the support of this committee and others to move some of those programs forward and get them into production. We will accept some risk. We can accept quite a bit of risk in early experimental phases where failure is acceptable, and we want to try things. But once we commit to a real product, we want to manage that risk so that we do get the product. And it includes trades-off between requirements sometimes and cost and other things and risk. It requires prudent investment to draw down risk, to drive it down as efficiently and quickly as possible. And General Brown was talking about risk over time. I'm very aware of the increasing threats that we're going to be facing, looking out at what their programs are and what they're going to be fielding. And as much as we might have concerns today, they're going to be much worse in the future if we don't make the right investments.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and gentlemen. Thank you for your service, and thank you for appearing here today. General Raymond, Among the support groups you have available to you are National Guard units. There's been a discussion about how those National Guard units might be integrated into the Space Force. Would you please discuss how this might be done, or if you intend to do it?
Yes, sir. We've operated, first of all, let me just say, we've operated with when we were in the Air Force, part of the Air Force, we operated with the Air National Guard for 25 years. There's 8 states that have Guard capabilities, space capabilities, and 1 territory in Guam. That represents 836 or so Guardian professionals that do the space mission. When the law was passed to establish the Space Force, Congress directed that we do a study on how best to integrate. If you have a service that has 14,000 people, there might be a way to do this more effectively. We did that study, and as a result of that study, we came up with the 1 component with the reserve and active being put together. And then on the Guard, there's several ways you can do it. And so you could keep the Guard in the Air National Guard and have the Air National Guard continue to provide support. You could, option 2 is you could take the Space National, or the men and women out of the Air National Guard and stand up as a separate Space National Guard. Or you can take those capabilities out of the Guard totally and put them in this 1 component. So there's multiple ways. The law, this NDA directed us to do some more study on the best way to do that.
Then you are fully aware that at least the California Air National Guard would like to have the space unit of that National Guard unit become a space directly into the Space Force.
Yes, sir. I'm aware they provide great capability. As I mentioned, 8 different states have this capability, and they provide us great.
My understanding is they're not the only National Guard unit around the nation.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. We're aware of this. We're going to follow it, obviously. General Brown, not my favorite subject, but one that you and I have spent some time on. The GBSD, you're not hiding the ball by changing the name, are you?
Not at all.
I didn't think so, but I want to be clear about it. Presently, the Minuteman III is expected to continue to perform until the late 2030s. Is that correct?
We will have aspects of the Minuteman III that will continue to perform, because as we bring on Sentinel or GBSD, we've got to make sure we still have the nuclear capability that is part of our integrated deterrence. So it's a transition. It's not a flip of a switch to get from one to the other. So we're going to have to continue to maintain Minuteman III capability to make that transition.
So the answer is the Minuteman III can be and will be maintained until the late 30s.
Aspects of the Minuteman III will be maintained to the 30s. You will not have the full capability required to support what we have as a requirement right now.
Well, that gets into a lot of detail, some of which is classified, and we will continue to pursue it. Have you figured out what it will cost on the military construction side to replace the Minuteman III systems?
We've done the analysis on that. I don't have the number exact number for you, but I can get that for the record.
There is no number, is there?
No, there is.
You really don't know what it's going to cost on the military construction side to replace all of the facilities necessary for the Sentinel/GBSD.
There is a number, and I know we've been working with your staff, and I'll get back with you to give you more detail and also more for the record.
It's presently not in the budget that's been presented to us. Is that correct?
I'd have to double check on that.
Okay. 50 seconds. The chairman raised an exceedingly important point in his opening comments, and that is the world seems to have changed rapidly in the last 3 months. And the most sophisticated airplanes and facilities of the Russian military seem to be incapable of overcoming some rather less sophisticated systems. I want to have a full discussion this year about what the chairman raised about maybe big, very expensive, very sophisticated systems may not be the future. We don't have time to go into it, but that issue needs to be fully discussed as we complete this NDAA. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. I was, again, so happy to point out how grateful I am for my dad's service with the 14th Air Force in India and China. And so I've just grown up, and I grew up in the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina, in the shadow of the Charleston Air Force Base. And so I just have, and I have a nephew in the Air Force too. So hey, very proud of y'all's service. Secretary Kendall, you've clearly articulated the urgent need to transform and modernize U.S. Air Force. I support the Air Force's plan to modernize its fighter fleet where smart and necessary, to divest aircraft to maximize our ability to field the most ready and lethal force possible. I'm concerned, though, that the Air Force is taking the path of least resistance when it comes to fighter roadmap. I understand the Air Force basing plan simply places F-35 at F-15C locations instead of those locations best suited to build and preserve F-35 combat readiness. What is your position that current and future F-35 basing decisions will include both a short and longer-term readiness criteria, and that you'll expand the candidate list beyond the installations with retiring aircraft? And second, will you ensure that you will direct your staff to seek out and evaluate creative basing solutions that provide for cost-effective, innovative basing solutions?
Congressman, I haven't had a chance to look at F-35 basing decisions yet in my tenure, but I will promise you to do so. Mission performance is going to be a very fundamental concern, and I don't think we should be overly constrained as we look at that metric. We need to support combatant commanders in all the theaters where we need to worry about high-end threats, but also we need to have forces that can flex and go support where they're needed when they're called upon. And I know we are deploying F-35s and basing F-35s forward, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Alaska is one of the bases that we've selected, which can provide support in either direction fairly efficiently. So those things I know are taken into account, but I haven't had a chance to review them personally. And I am open to creative ideas about this. I am always open, I hope, to creative ideas to improve our performance or our capabilities. I'll let General Brown comment. I'm sure he has more on that.
I appreciate the question. One of the areas is we are really looking more broadly across not only our fighter fleet, but many of our other fleets, stepping back and taking a more strategic look at what's the right basing based on the current environment, what we project the environment to be vis-a-vis the threat here in the future. And that will actually drive us into, as the Secretary described, being a little bit more creative than the way we've done things historically going forward for basing for fighters and other capabilities as well.
Thank you, both of you, for that. And again, Mr. Secretary, I'm grateful to work with Congressman Jim Clyburn, who physically represents the McIntyre Joint National Guard base, and which is so advantageous for long-term F-35 readiness. It is a U.S. Air Force owned and operated autonomous federal installation. It maintains an F-35 compatible infrastructure, provides exceptional clear airspace, and welcome to the community too. They like the sound of freedom. Has appropriated funding for F-35 compatible simulator facility, possesses organic ranges, hosts the best training environment on the East Coast with the most clear, again, without interfering with local communities, and retains unlimited space for growth and enjoys limited encroachment concerns. My question, will you work with Congressman Jim Clyburn and myself in a bipartisan effort to evaluate a F-35 basing plan for McIntyre Joint National Guard base, which not only affords the infrastructure for F-35 to thrive for decades, but also yields a modernized F-16 Block 52s for capture and use by the active Air Force institutional requirements, as well as capitalization of the fighter wing inside the Air National Guard?
Yes, Congressman, happy to work with you on that.
And I hope you visit beautiful Eastover, South Carolina, where, hey, Senator Clyburn's so lucky he represents such a wonderful community, and just, again, Joint Base does great. And then finally, a question in regard to upgrading F-35s. What's the consideration of installations across the Air National Guard for future F-35 basing, Ms. Secretary?
We will be upgrading F-35, some of the ones we bought in earlier configurations. I haven't had an opportunity to look at a plan for exactly how we're going to do that or what units will be affected. Mission requirements would, I think, be the driving concern in that, however. But I will take a look at that as part of the overall F-35 scheme for future fielding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Norcross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and welcome, gentlemen. Obviously, some things have changed, as they do each and every year, but when it comes to the tactical era, it has changed at a more rapid pace, certainly from what we're handed out today. So we heard earlier that back in 2010-12, the last F-22 was $130 million roughly. That's about $155 million today dollars versus the F-35 as we see it today, around $80 million, or the next block, which could be $90 to $95 million, and the EX and the prices. We're all concerned about the price that we buy these aircraft at. But we also know that 2/3 of the cost, almost 70%, is in the sustainment. So I think having a discussion of how much we're buying it versus how much it's costing us needs to be discussed together, because those are real dollars that are literally making us make decisions today on aircraft that were produced years ago and putting us in a very difficult position. NGAD being one of those, and the development costs for that 6th generation. Secretary, you talked about the F-22 being replaced by NGAD. When we look at some of the original projections of when that would be available, we are sliding to the right further later. In addition to coming in later, and there potentially is that gap that could take place, how do you look at closing that risk, that gap? And at what price do you expect a copy to come in of the NGAD? The price per copy, how much for that? And then we can talk about sustainment of it later on.
This is a number that's going to get your attention, but we're talking about prices that are multiple hundreds of millions of dollars for NGAD on an individual basis.
That's with the pilot, correct?
Yes.
The copy.
That's a piloted manned aircraft. So it's going to be an expensive airplane. F-22 was an expensive airplane. It was one of mine aircraft in one of my earlier positions. But it's also an incredibly effective aircraft. It's been dominant in the air for decades now. And we expect NGAD to be the same, but NGAD is going to have to be accompanied by things that are not as expensive to give overall mission capability, which is the reason we're going down the uncrewed combat aircraft route. You mentioned cost control. That starts in development. It starts with the design, a combination of the requirements, but also for sustainment in particular, ensuring that you can do upgrades and do maintenance very efficiently. So it's worth the time and the effort in the earlier phases of a program like NGAD to get those things right, because you're going to pay for what you did much later in sustainment with much bigger dollars. And from what I've seen of the NGAD program so far, that approach has been taken. They've taken a very good approach to having modular designs and interfaces that the government controls so they can upgrade the program over time, keep it current technically so it can stay in the force for a long time and stay as advanced as possible, but also to introduce competition, to get costs down through competition as you go forward. So despite the fact that it is going to be an expensive aircraft, there are a lot of things being done in that design today to keep the cost under control as much as possible.
And this is a discussion, Chairman Garamendi, in readiness. He keeps telling me I'm throwing a cheap plane that costs him more to sustain it. But let's talk about the accompanying NGAD more affordable. What are you looking at price per copy for some more of those? Expendable is probably not the right word, but
we don't have a final price per copy yet. We don't have a hard estimate, I think, yet that we could point to. You know, crude estimates are in the order of magnitude that I talked about.
All right, so we talked about the cost. How about the time frame, which is sliding to the right?
I'm sorry.
With the time frame, it's coming in much, or predicted to come in much later than we originally had expected.
I'm
when you
not
start
aware
talking about the F-22 holding out that long, there appears to be a
We're looking at fielding capability in the early 30s right now. You know, so I can get you a schedule we have. It's a classified program, so I'm not sure how many details we're even making public, but you know, it's in the early stages of development, but it's far enough along in terms of concept. It's actually built on, NGAD platform is built on a technology demonstration program that I started when I was Undersecretary for Acquisition was called the Aerospace Innovation Initiative, and it was to build X-planes that demonstrated key technologies for the next generation of tactical air warfare. And that program has been pretty successful. We've built some prototypes that have matured the key technologies, but now we have to go to the design we're going to use for production, which is not
Sorry,
going to be
the
exactly
gentleman's
the same.
time has expired. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary and Generals, thank you for being here. I do want to make sure that as we work towards that final number and we're looking at the list of unfunded priorities, that we're keeping into mind the civilian workforce and the uniform workforce and what inflation has done to them. And they are the most important asset that we have in the military. And as someone who represents Robins Air Force Base and Moody Air Force Base, I want to just make sure that that workforce is taken into account with what inflation has done to them. With that said, General Brown, your predecessor, General Goldfein, and I had a lot of discussions about JSTARS and ABMS. I will pick on the Army since they're not here. I did see their request this week for a manned aircraft for ground moving target indicator that looked very similar to what the JSTARS recap looked like. I know the Air Force is committed to ABMS, and I appreciate your commitment to that and to Robins Air Force Base. But is there any discussion with the Army potentially about transferring the GMTI mission that currently exists to them, since they're now requesting a manned GMTI platform?
We have not had that conversation. We talked to them about at least my intel professional talked to them about the platform, knowing and letting them know that the Space Forces are going to really help us with ground moving target indication based on some of the capabilities they're pursuing, and that's the approach we're taking as well. We do have the Global Hawk Block 40 that can do some of that as well. So I think there's ways we can solve this from a joint perspective using the Space Force capabilities. I question why we're going down the path of pursuing something that we're trying to move away from. And if you go back to, we're not going to be in permissive environments where you can actually operate like we have in the past.
So you understand my concerns with the difference of messaging today versus a few years ago with actually a manned ISR that is not survivable versus China and Russia. And any concerns about as the JSTARS drawdown becomes faster, the loss of ISR for our combatant commanders, or are you convinced that we can fill the capability gap with JSTARS coming down?
I believe we can fill the gap, but I also, as I said earlier, there will be some risk here. But I also think about how we do our ISR today. And it's not always from an airborne platform. With the amount of information that's available, the amount of capability we have in space, whether it's provided by the military, provided by the intelligence community, or things we're able to provide, look at commercially, there are so many different ways to get the information in ISR. And we're, in some cases, infatuated with some of the airborne platforms, but we have capacity and capability, and we've proven that time and time again of how we're able to get the information to our combatant commanders. It doesn't necessarily always come from an airborne platform.
General Raymond, I do have a question I want you to answer too, but it was announced earlier this week that we would no longer, the United States would no longer test ground-based systems to destroy satellites. Do you believe that the Chinese and the Russians would agree to no longer do that, or is this going to be an area where the United States is going to simply stand alone and our adversaries are going to continue to test the ability to use ground-based missiles to destroy satellites?
We're hoping that the initiative that we've taken, the administration has taken, will encourage others to join us. We're not giving anything up because we weren't going to do that kind of a test anyway. We can get the testing that we need done without a destructive debris-creating test. We just saw Russia recently do such a test. China's done them in the past, and we want to put as much pressure on them to not do that kind of test as possible, and this is part of the effort to do that.
If you look at the numbers of objects that we were talking about earlier, the number of objects that are going to be launched into space, we have got to keep the space domain free of debris. it's going to become increasingly congested. As the Secretary said, this was about destructive tests. There's other means of doing those tests. We would not do an irresponsible behavior like China or Russia has done in the past.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. General Brown, in a 2021 op-ed with General Berger, Commandant of the Marine Corps, you explained that a fundamental change is needed to occur to address the 2018 National Defense Strategy funding priorities was the definition of readiness. How do you define readiness? And how does this budget address the changes to that definition?
I look at readiness as not just based on availability of the capability or the amount of resources, but it's the aspect of our ability to have our airmen are trained to meet the demands to use that equipment in the scenarios that we expect to see in the future. In this particular budget, the areas we put into readiness is into our readiness accounts for our flying hour program, for our weapons and sustainment, but it's also into our operational test and training infrastructure into our ranges. And two of the key ranges that we're focused on is the Nellis test and training range and the Joint Pacific Alaska range up in Alaska J Park. Those are a couple of key areas. But the other aspect that I'll also tell you that's maybe not so much in the budget, but it's really our processes of how we do this and balance this. So there's ongoing conversations within the Air Force, but I also say with the Marine Corps and the Joint Force, how we do this a bit better. Matter of fact, conversations this last week of each of the services defined as readiness a little bit differently. We need to get closer to the same page and not only just look at availability, but capability and the trend lines associated with readiness as we make decisions for force management in the future.
If you have a bunch of aircraft that are ready to go, they can be flown tomorrow, but they're combat ineffective against the adversaries we're going to face, then that doesn't count as readiness. I think that's the key point. As this discussion goes on with the other services, please let us know if there's anything we can do to accelerate it, because I think this is a place where we clearly need to make a change to deal with the fast evolving threat. Have you been able to make any of these changes with your subordinate commands in terms of just how they report readiness up to you?
I have been able to, and part of this is us, being disciplined about the approaches we take, and our airmen want to serve, and therein lies part of the challenge. When things happen, they want to lean forward, but we got to balance that over time, and this is why we went to our Air Force Force Gen model to lay out, in really it's a 4-bin model to ensure that we can commit, be ready to commit, prepare, and then reset after we've been committed from a force standpoint. And that's a process we're going through internal to the Air Force to help reshape ourselves to ensure that we report readiness much better, but we don't burn all our readiness up front and then leave a hole when there's a crisis that comes in the future.
General Raymond, can you comment on this as well for the Space Force?
I'd be happy to. Historically, we've had the luxury of measuring our readiness in space against a peaceful, benign domain without a threat. And so that's not the domain that we find ourselves in today. So we've really done a restructure of how we do readiness as well. Part of that's the reporting to me to make sure that we're looking at it at a lens through a contested domain. The other thing that's different, we are largely employed in place. Most of our readiness models bias the deployed capabilities that deploy into theater. And so we've had to reconstruct our readiness models to best capture readiness from an employed in place 24/7 type of force.
Mr. Secretary, we've obviously been very focused on Ukraine lately. Can you give us 2 examples of lessons that we have learned from the conflict in Ukraine and how they are reflected in your budget?
We watched the buildup as it was occurring, and we're aware that there was a pretty significant probability that Russia would invade Ukraine. So there are some considerations perhaps from that in our budget. Generally speaking, the type of threat we're seeing there is not a surprise to us. And China being the pacing challenge from a technical point of view and an operational point of view, that was one that really motivated us more than anything else. We are all watching Ukraine right now, and it's a bit early to draw a lot of judgments from it. I'll leave the political other judgments to others, but from the point of view of military operations, and I think the chiefs can talk on this too, the failure of Russia to achieve air superiority early and to control the air decisively, I think has been a major impediment to their attempt in the invasion. The other thing on the other side of the equation is that the effectiveness of the air defenses, particularly weapons like Stinger and SA-10, and anti-armor munitions for that matter as well. Some of those weapons were very important in keeping the Russians out of the air and extracting losses from them. Part of that is because of the tactics that the Ukrainians used. They used what they had well, and they were able to keep those systems alive despite the threat and use them
Gentleman's
effectively.
time
So we
has
can learn a lot from that.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Desjardins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, the unfunded priorities list that you submitted to Congress included $197 million for hypersonic testing. And I'd like to get a better idea of where that money is going. So first, how do you assess the current hypersonic test capability within the Air Force Test Center? And second, what impact will the requested funding have in shoring up the existing gaps in that capability?
Thank you, Congressman. Just to be clear, I did not submit an unfunded requirements list. Chief Brown and Chief Raymond did. We did put money mostly through the Secretary of Defense's office, the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, into advancing our hypersonic test capabilities. And I'll let General Brown talk about the explicit impact of the addition he would increase. But I believe it would simply accelerate what we were already planning to do to get us more capability sooner.
Okay, General Brown.
Sure. You know, part of the reason why we wanted to put this not only in funded priority list, but as we look through our budget is all the services that are pursuing hypersonic capability, our hypersonic test facilities are not where they need to be, not only in capability, but also in capacity. And what I wanted to do with this unfunded priority was actually put more focus. We already put some investment into it, but we continue to put more investment into those facilities. And we work very closely with OSD because they have most of the oversight for this, but we've got to work together with the other services to ensure we can do the testing to ensure we can provide that capability here in the future.
Okay. I'm curious to know whether you would like to see Congress consider increasing thresholds for minor construction authorities like the Lab Revitalization Development Program in light of the inflation that we're seeing impacting this money.
I would say that would give us a bit more flexibility for minor construction. I think this is something we probably need to review periodically as costs increase, whether it's inflation or just general cost and how we define that. We do that in other areas as well. I think it'd be worth considering.
Okay. Back to you, Secretary Kendall. In the recent months, you've made some interesting comments on your vision for hypersonic weapons and the purpose they should play in the U.S. arsenal. Last month at a panel for the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, you questioned, you had the question of whether you can do the job with conventional missiles at less cost just as effectively, and then went on to say that hypersonics are a way of penetrating defenses, but they're not the only way, and I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on those thoughts.
A combination of things we can do, which includes stealth, decoys, penetration aids of various types, jamming. So there are other things we can do to penetrate defenses. Hypersonics do have a role, and we do need hypersonics. I don't think that they're a panacea, and they're not always the most cost-effective solution, but they are an important capability that we do want to get into the inventory.
Mm-hmm. We've all been kind of concerned at some of the AARW's failures over the past year. And we poured significant investment into those in the FY22 budget. Can you provide us with an update on the Air Force plans and goals to develop the field of hypersonic weapons? And then in the FY23 budget request, it looks like we may be shifting focus away from the AARW towards the hypersonic attack cruise missiles. And would you say that's fair?
We funded the research and development on Aero. We haven't funded the production yet. And the reason for that is primarily that they've had a number of test failures. We want to see some success before we commit production money. We're interested in both of those concepts, and I think I'd have to get into some classified information to talk about the exact applications of both.
Okay. General Raymond, as the conflict in Ukraine drags on, we continue to see China and Russia inch closer together diplomatically and militarily, and this extends into the space domain as well. As we see Sino-Russian ties produce agreements for cooperation on lunar missions and proposed joint international lunar research station, how are you assessing the threat environment in the space domain currently, and are you concerned by these closer ties between Russia and China?
Space is clearly a warfighting domain. As I mentioned, there's a significant threat today, and that threat is growing everything from reversible jamming to kinetic destruction. It is concerning to see Russia and China work together in areas that would not be in our best interest. But I will tell you, we have the best partnerships and allies in the world, and it's one of our great strengths. We have worked really hard over the past couple years to really strengthen these. Not only, it used to be that our international partnerships were one-way kind of data sharing arrangements. Now we're operating together, training together, developing norms of behavior together, funding capabilities together. So I would put the strength of our partnerships well ahead of anything that China might do.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Raymond, thank you for your testimony. I was pleased to see in your written testimony you address how the Space Force can help confront challenges in the gray zone. As you know well, Russia and China are saturating the globe with state-backed propaganda, and we don't have to look further than Russia's blatant lies about its invasion of and the ongoing war in Ukraine to see this trend. Within the broader context of gray zone activities, how do you think Space Force can strengthen and amplify joint force initiatives to confront this challenge?
I think we've seen in the conflict, the Russian-Ukraine conflict, where space has...
I'm sorry, General, can you just wait 1 second? I can't hear. Okay, proceed.
I think you've seen very clearly in the Russian-Ukraine conflict where space, including commercial space, has provided great advantage to Ukraine, especially in the gray zone. Commercial space has allowed us to share information much more broadly. It has allowed us to see the AOR in much greater clarity. And so I think space has been really instrumental in helping shape this gray zone competition, especially leading up to the conflict.
Excellent. Mr. Kendall, Secretary Kendall, the Solomon Islands recently signed a security agreement with China, which would allow Beijing to deploy troops to the Solomons and could even result in the first Chinese military base in the Pacific. This altering the status quo requires the United States to further strengthen our regional alliances and partnerships. What is your perspective on expanding the Five Eyes intelligence partnership to close allies in the region such as Japan or South Korea? Japan's ISR network, for example, is robust with capabilities including the RQ-4s, E-2s, and P-1s, all of which would be critical additions to the theater situation awareness in any Taiwan scenario. Is the Air Force considering anything along those lines or contributing to any discussions on the potential expansion of Five Eyes?
That would not be something the Air Force would do on its own. That would be something that would be done, at least at the DoD level, I think. We do work very closely with Japan and South Korea. This is the idea of Japan becoming part of the Five Eyes or Korea becoming potentially part of it has come up before, but that's not something the Air Force is working directly.
And so there's no discussion at all, from what you know of, from the other services speaking to the DoD about the possibility of something like that?
I'm not aware of that. I'm aware of conversations about increasing cooperation with our close partners, but not specifically expanding the Five Eyes construct. I can take that for the record and get you an answer.
General Brown, thank you again for your testimony, and I appreciate your warning of accelerated change or lose, and your vision for a more flexible and capable force. In your written testimony, you explain the hard decisions the service must make in coordination with Congress on how to modernize the force and develop and field new capabilities, while selectively divesting older platforms. Regarding the A-10, for example, the Air Force itself is planning to divest 21 A-10s from the Indiana Air National Guard in FY23. What is the modernization plan for the remaining A-10s? Will the airframes that have been selected for rewinging be added to that maintenance schedule?
The plan for the long range is we bought the attack kits, and that the attack kit is to rewing the remaining A-10s. If I have the numbers correct, it's about 218 that we'll actually have set to rewing. But the 21 that are going to retire will not be rewinged, and those will get transitioned out, and that guard unit will actually transition to F-16s.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, in the simplest terms possible, could you describe what agile combat employment is and how it might be implemented in a Taiwan scenario specifically?
The idea behind agile combat employment, and I should let Chief Brown talk about this too, because I think he's one of the founding fathers of it, is that we compound the targeting problem for our adversaries by using more than the bases that we normally operate from. There's a hub and spoke concept, if you will, where alternative locations are used to conduct operations. So an adversary would have to target all of those potential locations in order to effectively target our force. And the Air Force has been training people, and it's been doing exercises to demonstrate some of that capability, and the Chief can talk about that a bit more, perhaps. What we're doing under the operational imperatives is trying to look at the full mix of investments we would need to make that truly a cost-effective approach. There are limited numbers of bases that we can conceivably use because of the size of runways and the infrastructure that we need. And so they are targetable. We would need to deny targeting capability, but even without it, those fixed sites can still be attacked. So you need to look at a mix of defenses and hardening and other measures that we would want to invest in to make sure that was a robust capability and really preserved our ability to put missions in the air. You know, the tactical air assets that we have deployed forward aren't of much value if they can't get in the air because their runways are taken out, basically, or they can be potentially destroyed themselves on the ground, as well as the infrastructure that supports them. So we have got to protect against that.
In a Taiwan scenario, to fully realize the vision of agile combat employment, would that require new basing agreements, specifically in the Philippines and in Japan?
It would require a combination of factors. One would be host countries or alternate sites that were under our possession, that were prepared to accept the aircraft and use them. We've been practicing agile combat employment in Europe right now as part of the preparations we've made over there. So the concept is sound. It's the right idea. It's the right thing to do. But we have to think through all the things that are required to make it a reality in a wartime situation. Yeah. And we haven't done all that work yet. There's more to be done there.
Putting on my milpers hat, I took the Air Force PFT yesterday. It was fun at bowling, and you had two airmen that were conscripted into doing it with me, so they deserve an attaboy for doing that. So my understanding is if you get a first-class score, you only have to take it once a year, but if you don't meet the height and weight standards, you have to do it twice a year. Is that correct?
Congressman, I want to compliment you on your performance on that test. I heard about it, and it was pretty impressive.
Well, I got old man points. Very generous.
I'll let the Chief talk about the...
But it's not the height and weight, it's a score. And if your score is, if I recall, is below 75, then you do it twice a year versus once a year. So if you get a high score, if you've proven that you're staying pretty fit, then we don't make you do it twice a year.
So there was a story this week. I don't think it's a new policy per se, but if you are an airman undergoing transgender reassignment surgery, you don't have to take it for the year while the surgery is happening. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So then after you transition, let's say you're a biological male and you undergo gender reassignment surgery to become a female, are you then held to the female standards in the test versus the male standards?
The way we do that is based on what what the member identifies as for their gender is what drives what tests and other support we provide to those particular members.
Okay, so if you identify as a female, or underwent surgery to become a female, you would then go from having to run to get a max score of 9 minutes and 12 seconds for 1.5 miles to 10 minutes and 23 seconds for 1.5 miles, correct?
Not having a chart in front of me, I know they're different, but that's probably...
So that's a difference of 1 minute and 11 seconds, depending on what gender you identify for the run. For push-ups, the change is from 67 push-ups in 1 minute to 47 push-ups in 1 minute. This is for the youngest age. This is 25 and younger. I'm 38, so I got more generous scale yesterday. I mean, that's a difference of 20 push-ups, right? Going from male to female for the strength portion.
Without the charts in front of me, it's probably close.
And then sit-up goes from 58 to 54. So that's small. That's 4. And then my understanding is you now have the option for every domain. Well, the run you have an option. The strength portion you have an option of sit-up, plank, and then something else that confused me yesterday.
We're in the process of implementing those changes to provide additional options for our members based on how they exercise.
I have 9 seconds. So is the idea to retain the optionality or to coalesce around one for each domain?
Optionality. Well, optionality based on each domain, whether it's aerobic versus whether it's strength.
I apologize. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Escobar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panelists for their service and for their leadership and for being with us today. I have the incredible honor and privilege of representing El Paso, Texas, which is home to Fort Bliss, America's second largest military installation and largest joint mobilization force generation installation in the Army. I'd like to take this opportunity, though, to coming on the heels of Mr. Gallagher's comments, or questions rather, I want to thank you all for your recent announcement to expand basic human rights protections to service members and their families. I have to tell you, this is especially important in states like mine, states that have moved to ban gender-affirming care for minors, restrict teaching about sexual orientation in public and gender identity in public schools, and prohibit trans athletes from playing on girls' sports teams. I have spoken with many, many families who feel targeted and who have to shift their worry about other things to worry about care for their kids. And so your leadership and your response to these really targeted discriminatory laws against families in states like mine, I hope it will influence other branches of service to provide similar protections. My question to any one of our panelists who would like to answer this is, as I mentioned, I've heard from constituents, we need our service members focused on their mission, not on their kids' health care or limits to accessing that care. Families should be supported in all ways possible to ensure readiness of our service members. And I understand that through the Exceptional Family Member Program, service members are allowed to be reassigned to different states with safer environments for their families. And so that makes me wonder if you've seen personnel impacted or take advantage of that, and also how the service will account for or think about basing deployment decisions based on this type of quality of life question, especially around discrimination in states like Texas, Florida, and other states. And really for anyone who would like to answer that for me.
Thanks for the question. What we've been doing, what I think you're alluding to, is making sure that our service airmen and guardians are aware of some of the services that they can use because of some of the recent changes in state law. The other services have very similar programs. They have legal assistance, and they have the Exceptional Family Member Program as well. We don't take any position on these laws one or the other, except we recognize the fact that they do affect our people. The Exceptional Family Member Program in particular helps people who have unique medical conditions that may not be treatable in a certain location. Usually it's because of lack of care, because somebody has a condition where either the environment, in case of asthma, would affect them, or because there simply isn't any care in the region where they would be assigned that's appropriate for their specialized condition. Transgender medical condition of gender dysphoria is one that could be affected for some of our people. I'm not aware of any cases where this has happened yet, but I expect it will at some point. This is a condition that often occurs among adolescents, and our dependents will probably be affected by it at some point. So we made them aware that some of the EFMP program in particular was available to them if they were impacted that way.
Thank you, Mr. Kendall. I'm going to move on very quickly to my next question, shifting gears because I've only got about a minute left. General Raymond, as the Space Force has continued to grow, I've been really encouraged by its efforts to reach out to universities for research and prepare the next generation of potential guardians. One of those initiatives is at the University Partnership Program, which included the university in my district, the University of Texas at El Paso. Can you give me a quick update on the initiative and what lies ahead? I've got 30 seconds, so you may have to respond in writing.
I'll be happy to respond in writing, but it's an initiative that we're proud of. It builds partnerships with universities in twofold. One, to help develop and attract talent, and two, to help do some critical research for our critical space needs. We're very pleased to have UTEP as part of that. We've got 11 different universities as part of it, and we're seeing benefits of that already. And I'll be happy to respond in more detail in writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Raymond. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Secretary Kendall, are you saying that if a service member has a transsexual family member or a family member who might one day want to become a transsexual person, that the Air Force might not send that service member to a state like Florida or a state like Texas based on our laws?
What we do, and we've been doing this for a very long time, is whenever anybody comes up for assignment, they go through a questionnaire about their family and their medical needs and special education, things like that. And based on that questionnaire, we examine whether in the region they might be assigned to, there might be some issue with providing them with what they need. And then if that's the case, we don't assign them there. We find something else, someplace else for them to go. There are about 35,000 servicemen that are under that program right now, and about 55,000 people that are affected by it. So it has a lot of broad applicability.
But usually we would think about this exceptional family member program like if a service member had a child with a specific heart disease and they could only get treatment at Johns Hopkins, you might not send them to a place where they wouldn't be able to access that treatment. What I think is new is that you're now applying that to transsexuals and people who might want to be transsexuals. So again, I want to ask the question very directly. Is it the position of the Air Force that if someone has a transsexual family member and they don't want to go to a state like Florida or Texas, that you will accommodate their request to not go to Florida or Texas based on the gender issues of a family member?
If a service member is under treatment for a recognized medical condition, such as gender dysphoria, and they cannot get that treatment in the state to which they might be assigned, then they could be assigned to another state.
And it's
but
not
there has
just,
to be an actual
and it's not
medical
just if
need.
they're under treatment. Captain Tana Dawnsworth told the Washington Post, family members receiving gender-affirming treatment or likely to receive such treatment. So isn't it true? Did Captain Downsworth misstate that? Does someone have to be
I'd have to
receiving this
check
treatment?
the exact wording of how the program is set up. But there has to be a identified actual need for medical treatment, not just the potential for one. It has to be more than that.
And
that's my understanding.
A
I'll
family
get back to
member
you on the
choosing
record
to change their gender would qualify, is what you're saying.
I'm sorry.
So I mean, a family member choosing to change their gender would alter the options you have for where you could put that service member.
I think more would be required. There would have to be a medical need that needs to be met. Just that decision by itself probably wouldn't be enough, but I don't know.
I'm concerned that it's going beyond medical need in some of the statements of some of the folks who work for you. I'm now quoting from Undersecretary Gina Ortiz, who said, "We are closely tracking state laws and legislation to ensure we're prepared to mitigate effects to our airmen, guardsmen, and families." And again, this is dealing with the transsexual issue with the Exceptional Family Member Program. So which state laws and local laws are you particularly concerned about?
We have people in our major installations who track local conditions, including state laws, all the time.
Which ones?
That's what they do, all of them. If there's a change in divorce laws just occurred in one of the states, it could affect our members. So our people have to be aware of that so they can provide counseling to people if they need it.
Well,
I'm
going to move on because I've got another
in
topic to cover, and while that seems deeply frivolous, this is quite serious. I want to go to hypersonics. In what areas is the United States outpacing China in hypersonics?
I think we're outpacing China in air-breathing hypersonics.
Okay.
Cruise missile type application.
Well, those are cruise missiles. Are cruise missiles hypersonic?
A specific type of hypersonic with a scramjet engine. It gets above Mach 5.
Well, let me ask this question.
Normal cruise
General
missiles
Van
are not.
Herk said, China is significantly outpacing us with their capabilities. Was General Van Herk wrong?
No, China has moved to deploy hypersonic weapons more aggressively than the United States has, definitely.
And so when General Van Herk says China's aggressively pursuing hypersonic capability tenfold to what we have done, is that a ratio that is incorrect or correct?
I don't know how he would make that measurement. They have fielded more capability than we have, and they have fairly aggressive development programs in a number of areas. I wouldn't put a number.
More aggressive than ours. So they're developing faster
yes.
than us. I mean, General Brown just said that we're not where we need to be on hypersonic testing, which I think is a helpful admission because we should actually work together to solve that. But what you're saying is they're testing and developing more, they're fielding more, and they're more capable, right? That's the essence of this thing?
They have invested more, and they are more capable, but you have to be very careful about these comparisons.
Thank you. That is just like exactly the opposite of what Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and particularly noteworthy. I'm afraid I'm out of time.
Mr. Horsford is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll get back to the hearing at hand, which is on the budget. Secretary Kendall, contract adversary air has proven itself to be a cost-effective training enabler for the Air Force Weapons School and during major exercises like Red Flag. In May 2021, the commander of Air Combat Command, General Mark Kelly, wrote, and I quote, "Currently, there is a high opportunity cost to self-generated AD-air, which is the norm for fifth-gen squadrons. A pilot flying Red Air is using precious flight hours on the most expensive aircraft and yet not realizing any significant training or readiness value," end quote. So your department told us repeatedly, told me, this committee and industry, that there would be a consistent future need for these services. However, it has been clear for years that the Air Force was looking to improve the capability of these contract aircraft to better reflect the high-end fight. In response to this clear demand signal, this year industry went to 2 allied European air forces and acquired 24 F-16s, the same aircraft flown by the current organic aggressors at Nellis Air Force Base. Last month, I was pleased to learn that the Air Force had also decided to permanently base 9 F-35s at Nellis as part of the 65th Aggressor Squadron at a future unspecified date. In response to a question about this basing decision, the Air Force informed Congress on April 8th that changes to the organic aggressor fleet would not cause a decrease in the number of contracted adversary air pilots, and that there were no projected changes for any contract adversary air company. However, I was surprised to recently learn that at this point, the Air Force had already notified the Nellis adversary air contractor that their contract would not be renewed and that they would have to vacate Nellis by June 4th. The Air Force then told my staff on April 20th, 12 days after informing Congress that no changes to adversary air were planned, that they did not intend to recompete the Nellis contract and that they would transition entirely to organic adversary air beginning on June 4th. Yesterday in our meeting, General Brown, you highlighted the importance of future virtual constructive training at Nellis. And while I fully support efforts to fill these capabilities, I've been told that we are still years away from the infrastructure and the software required to take full advantage of these systems. So I think you can understand my skepticism regarding simulators when problems with the F-35 virtual environment have delayed a full rate production decision for the program by over a decade. And I'm confused how the Air Force plans to replace the 44,000 flying hours, representing 63% of adversary air requirements, that the contractor currently flies at Nellis without the existing organic F-16 fleet, especially when no date has been given for the arrival of F-35s or additional aircraft. So I think it's important to note that the organic aggressors at Nellis have 2 missions: to both fly as aggressors and to support the test and evaluation unit. What happens when test and evaluation requirements compete with training? So I'm deeply concerned that the apparent lack of cohesive adversary air plan will not only continue to lead to uncertainty for my constituents, but also hurt the readiness of our pilots while they wait until an uncertain date for this future virtual environment to be fielded or for F-35s to be delivered. So Secretary Kendall, with no additional aircraft on the ramp and a full capability simulation environment still years away, how does the Air Force intend to bridge the capability gap for adversary air at Nellis? What is the specific strategy for adversary air across Air Combat Command?
Let me start by saying that we do need adversary air. It's an important part of our training regimen. The problem we have right now is that we need 5th generation adversary air. And the current capability we have in our contract doesn't provide that. It's the reason the F-35s are being brought in. That gap exists today, and it can't be healed by extending the contract that's in place. So that's the problem we're
Is
trying
that
to
the
solve.
only
We're
need
also
that we have?
working, I'm sorry,
Is
Congressman.
that the only need that we have is to prepare for fifth generation? Don't we have other threats that we also have to continue to prepare for?
It is not the
rest,
only need,
rest
but
of
it
this
is a
conversation will
key
have to be
need.
on the
I'll let
record. The
General
gentleman-
Brown.
I'm sorry, the gentleman's
amplify.
time has expired, Mr. Secretary, I apologize. So the question goes on that long, runs out of time, so you have to submit it for the record. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all three of you being here today, and thank you for your leadership. A couple statements before I get to a question. First, I would just like to address the President's budget. It calls for a 4.5% increase or 4% increase in spending for the military and a 12% increase for domestic spending, non-military. Pretty good disparity there. We know inflation's at 8.5% though. So effectively, the President budget is calling for about a 4.5% cut to the military. I don't think that's appropriate in a time of Ukraine and a rising China. So I hope that this committee and Congress increases that spending to at least even with inflation, hopefully more than inflation, to deal with these rising threats. But because of this budget, we're seeing that the Air Force has to grapple with the nuclear recapitalization, whether it's the B-21s, the ICBMs. But because of a 4.5% cut to the spending, you're having to reduce your F-35 buy, and we end up with less aircraft this year than when we started. Same thing with the Navy, less ships by the time we're done. I just think our country's not being served with this kind of reduction in spending. Then tied to that's the Air Force budget. I don't think appropriate that the DoD doesn't account for the pass-through money that the Air Force gets. They're showing a $234 billion budget, roughly a third amongst the services. But yet we know $40 billion that is supposedly the Air Force never enters the hands of the Air Force. It's passed through to other agencies that have nothing to do with the Air Force. 17% of the budget from the OSD that shows it's going to the Air Force never goes to the Air Force. And it makes it hard for Congress, I believe, to deal with this appropriately. We're trying to figure out what is the appropriate budget for the Air Force when you're doing B-21s, new ICBMs, the F-35, and so forth. So I know the Air Force is accounting this right. You're showing a $194 billion budget, and I appreciate your transparency. But I think we need that here, too. My first question deals with the electronic warfare part of the budget with the Air Force. I'm grateful the Air Force is showing 4 EC-37s on the unfunded list. I think if we don't fund these this year, we'll have 2 years without a production line, and I'm worried about losing that expertise. So we're going to try hard to get at least some of those, if not all of them, funded through the unfunded list. But my question would be to the Chief, what more can we be doing in Congress for the electronic warfare program? Are we adequately giving you what you need?
Well, I think it's one of these areas we got to continue to work on. And I think you've heard me say publicly before, electronic warfare is an aspect that we have not been as focused on, partly because of the threats we're up against over the course of the past 20 to 30 years. The world has changed. And we've got to put, not only in terms of the Air Force, but as we work our budgets, to put more emphasis on electronic warfare and the capability, whether it's done by cyber, how we use AI, machine learning aspects of this, and the platforms that we operate as well. They'll all play a factor in this, not only for us on the offensive, but we also be prepared to operate in that type of environment as well with our platforms and our people.
I think your statements have been very helpful on the electronic warfare program, that we needed to turn around and get pointed the right way. A lot of folks assume the EC-37 is not a near-peer capable aircraft, but it is. Without going into the classified material, it has some of the latest technology, and I'm excited about what it will bring. To our space chief, how does our investment in space capabilities compare with China's? I mean, is it comparable, or they're putting more in, or are we putting more in?
Sir, it's really hard to tell what China's putting in because they're not transparent in their budgets, and there's a blurry line between what's government and what's commercial. So I can tell you, what I can tell you in this budget, the department has invested pretty significantly in space to make sure that we've got the capabilities.
It's a pretty good increase in space funding. Hopefully it meets the needs. My last question is back to General Brown. We hear reports of airmen, NCOs having to go on SNAP program, needing nutrition help. Should we not look at revising the enlisted pay, especially at the junior ranks? Should we be focusing on this? I guess it's also a question for General Raymond. Should Congress be looking at this more about increasing enlisted pay?
I think across the board, I mean, this is something we could continuously take a look at based on the environment. You know, we started out with a conversation on inflation. As we look at our pay and benefits, it's not just the pay, but it's also the benefits that support our family members. And that's an aspect when you think about our airmen. It's not just the pay, but it's the other things that happen in support of them and their families, the communities they live in. And so looking at pay and benefits together, I think would be appropriate.
It seems egregious that we have young enlisted folks on SNAP and other nutrition programs. That's unacceptable. But thank you with that, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Laurie is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I want to start with you, Secretary Kendall. I've been, reading into the details of the Air Force defense budget request, and did you task the service to consider canceling the F-15EX in this budget?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Did you task the Air Force to consider canceling the F-15EX during this budget?
As we went through the budget build process, we looked at a lot of options. And I really don't want to go into the details of what any of those were. We ended up where we ended up after a long process. The numbers we started out initially at were very different than numbers we ended up at for a variety of reasons. So I really can't go into our internal processes very well and what we did in that.
But just to summarize, so instead of canceling the program, which was a recommendation you wanted to look into, you're actually doubling the buy from last year. Can you explain that?
We're accelerating the buy to buy it out. We're actually reducing the total quantity substantially. I think it was 100 and CQ help me with this, 124. We went down to 80 as a total buy. But we're trying to buy that out as quickly as possible. We made some other adjustments in order to do that. It's a more efficient way to buy the capability.
Okay. I mean, I would be interested more in, that decision-making process, from our side to understand it. But there's an article that I read. It was published on April 19th in Breaking Defense. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but it has the cost comparison between the F-15EX and the F-35A. The article compares the flyaway cost of the two different aircraft, and it says that the flyaway cost for the F-15EX is 39% higher than the flyaway cost for the F-35A, and that the cost to operate the F-15EX is 10% higher than the F-35. Do you agree with that assessment as outlined in this article?
We haven't had a chance to analyze that. The cost of those two aircraft are roughly comparable. Part of the problem is we're buying a 15EX in relatively.
So you haven't analyzed it? 39% seems like a pretty big delta to me.
We're buying the F-15EX for the unique capabilities that it provides. General Brown mentioned earlier that it's a weapons truck, basically. Carries more munitions than the F-35 can. So for certain missions, like cruise missile defense of the United States or defensive counter-air missions, it's a superior platform, despite the lack of some of the full fifth-generation capabilities. It does have a number of fifth-generation components on it to give it more capability than a baseline F-15 would have.
And for comparison's sake, and if General Brown, you wanted to jump in on this as well, which airframe is more lethal as far as a China-Taiwan scenario is concerned? Which would be more useful for that scenario?
I don't look at just one particular platform. It's the mix of platforms and the aspect of the stealth of the F-35 and its capability. But I'd also take a look at the F-15EX and its ability. It's going to be the first aircraft to carry HACM, a hypersonic air-launched cruise missile that can be carried on a fighter. So it's a combination of the capabilities where you can penetrate but also do standoff capability. So the two of them complement each other in addition to the other capabilities that we have on the fighter, in our fighter fleet.
Okay. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Banks is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Brown, in 2018, then Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson announced the Air Force We Need proposal. That proposal stated that the Air Force needs to grow from 312 operational squadrons to 386 operational squadrons by 2030. This also included growing the number of fighter squadrons in the total force from 55 today to 62 fighter squadrons in the future. In light of the latest 2022 National Defense Strategy, does the Air Force still need 62 fighter squadrons in order to compete and deter against the threat that China poses today?
The way I've been thinking about this is the equivalent capability of 62 fighter squadrons. And what I think about is when you look at the operational imperatives and the aspect of the fighter squadrons the way we do today with manned aircraft versus what the secretaries and we're working through on the operational imperatives, the combination of crewed and uncrewed platforms. We're doing it with on NGAD, we're looking at it with B-21, but I think it has applicability across our force. And part of the conversation we're talking about today is what does a future fighter squadron look like? How many manned platforms versus unmanned platforms you will have? And with the number of unmanned platforms, it'll make it much easier for us to expand that fighter capability. And it's not just the capability, but the capacity as well.
Can you talk about how you would posture those fighter squadrons between the Air Force active and reserve components?
You know, one of the areas that we are looking at is we are doing a bit of a global posture review. And one of the things I got to take a look at is to ensure that we have both the right overseas and CONUS mix so we can have the rotational out of the United States for our airmen and families. At the same time, the right mix between the active and reserve component. And that's ongoing work we're doing right now. And I've got all three components, active, guard, and reserve, in the conversation to ensure that we get the right mix, put a marker out in front of us, and then make sure we're moving in that direction.
Secretary Kendall, can you more specifically describe the Air Force's plan for the A-10 fleet?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I couldn't hear the
I'm
question.
over here, Secretary. Can you more specifically describe for us the plan for the A-10 fleet?
The plan for the FY23 budget is to take 21 A-10s out in Indiana and replace them with F-16. You know, in future years, we are looking at divesting over time the A-10 fleet. That's been something we've been trying to do for some time.
Can you put a timeline on when you would divest of the entire fleet versus the changes that you want to make in this budget?
If we were free to do so, we would divest the entire fleet by the end of the next 5-year plan.
But that's not not specifically what would happen with this year's budget, FY20.
This year, divest 21 in Indiana and replace them with F-16. It's a very specific and, I think, modest request at this point.
How long have you wanted to make this change?
I think that specific one's been in the works for some time. We were not allowed in the last year to retire the A-10s that we wanted to retire. We were not successful in that endeavor. But they're not what we need for the force for the future, and we'd still like to make that move as soon as we can.
What can you talk about, Secretary Kendall? What aircraft replaces the capabilities of the A-10 if we do divest of them?
The fighter mix that General Brown has talked about, it's not a one-for-one swap out of one aircraft for another. It's about the fighter mix that we're trying to get to over time.
And then for the A-10s that will not be divested of in fiscal year 2023, are you looking at wing modernization programs or any other plans that we should be aware of?
I think we're completing some modest modernization plans that have been in place for a while. Is that right?
Yeah, very, very modest things that we've already invested in. You know, with the sunset rule, we typically don't try to put a lot of capability, but we got to make sure we balance that risk as we go forward, so we don't have a big gap in capability.
General, can you as well describe or defend the plan, at least just for fiscal year 2023, to make this change and then the divesting of the entire fleet down the road? Explain why it's important.
It's because of the threat. The A-10 is a great airplane in a permissive environment, but I don't expect we'll be in very many permissive environments in the future. And I've got to have a mix of capability that can do a bit of all things. The A-10 cannot do that, in a particular high-threat environment, and that's why we're making that shift.
Can you more specifically talk about the second or third order effect of moving forward with this plan? I mean, what does it allow you to do?
What it allows me to do is there's a manpower piece associated with this, because you have airmen that are actually operating and maintaining A-10s that we'd actually put into F-35s and F-15EXs and eventually NGAD. Those airmen, a 15-year maintainer doesn't come off the bench. You build those, and we had to make that transition. So that's an important aspect of this.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Kehele is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mahalo, Secretary Kendall, General Brown, General Raymond, for being here today, for your leadership of our United States Air Force. Secretary Kendall, you approved the legislative proposal that was sent to Congress this month to combine active duty and reserve components into a U.S. Space Force with full-time and part-time members, effectively canceling any plans for an Air National Guard component of the Space Force. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
Well, Mr. Secretary, this is particularly concerning to me. Dismantling Air National Guard space units would immediately degrade operational readiness that would take about 7 years to regrow and cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, in Hawaii, this decision would displace approximately 50 airmen currently assigned to the Hawaii Space Unit and a total planned force structure of 88 members of the 293rd Space Control Squadron located at the Pacific Missile Range facility on Kauai. How much would it cost the Department of Defense and the Space Force to establish this new active duty capability as outlined in this legislative proposal?
The proposal does not do away with any existing force structure. It changes the way we manage the reserve and the active component of the Space Force. The guardsmen, the Air Guard people who are supporting the Space Force now will continue to do so. They are very valuable assets, and we do not want to lose them. They're critical to the space mission. What we're discussing is how they're labeled and what kind of an organizational construct they fit into. The concern the administration has is that the overhead cost of creating a new independent Space Guard as an entity would be significant. And that's the reason that the administration has opposed the creation of a Space Guard writ large. There are a number of ways I think we can solve this problem, but at the end of the day, what we need is to keep those people in uniform and to keep them doing what they are doing, whether they're called Air Guard or Space Guard or something else. That's the end state that we want. And we're happy to work with the Congress as we try to find a way forward to make that happen. I'd like to give General Raymond a chance to...
Well, I believe the Space National Guard would provide a seamless surge capacity for the Space Force while capturing the training and talent of active duty Space Force personnel who move to the private sector and want to continue their service in the National Guard. So, General Raymond, using your best military advice, do you think we should or should not have a Space National Guard?
We've been operating with the Guard for 25 years. They provide critical capability and provide great personnel. As our Secretary said, there's multiple ways you can do this. You can have a separate Space National Guard. You can utilize the Air National Guard to continue doing what we're doing today, or you can take those capabilities out of the Guard and put them into this active duty reserve combined. There's multiple ways you can do it, but the key is, as the Secretary said, is the guardsmen and women that are in the space business and the capabilities they operate, we rely on today, and we're going to rely on them in the future.
You know, Congress has made, CBO has made incorrect assumptions regarding the size and scope of a Space National Guard. In its cost estimates, which yielded a cost estimate of $100 million in annual operation and support costs and a one-time construction cost of $20 million. It's why Congressman Crow and I sent a letter to CBO asking them to rescore the costs of establishing a Space National Guard because the cost should be minimal. Those same personnel that General Raymond you just talked about will continue to execute their missions within the Space National Guard at the same duty stations, so no new construction is needed. From a cost perspective, why should we go forward with this policy when we already have the talent within the Air National Guard to train, deploy, and provide critical space capability for the Space Force using existing infrastructure? General Raymond.
Today there's about 839 guardsmen in the Air National Guard that support the Space Force. 839 in 8 states and 1 territory. Again, they provide critical capability for us. And again, there's multiple ways you can do this, and there's different costs associated with each one of those ways, but there's multiple ways you can do it. The critical piece of this, though, is that we rely on them today, and we're going to have to rely on them in the future.
Secretary Kendall, Congress has requested multiple reports on the value and feasibility of establishing a Space National Guard. Any idea why the Congress hasn't received these reports submitted to the Congress on the value and feasibility of establishing a Space National Guard?
The short answer is I don't know. We should be able to provide you with information. I'm not sure why that hasn't happened. Now, I know you know what the administration's position is, obviously, on this, and it's a fairly firm position, but it is based on concerns about overhead and cost. And again, we'd be happy to have a dialogue with you and try to find a solution that was mutually acceptable that get us what we all want, which is to keep these people in uniform and serving their country.
Thank you for your answers. Mahalo, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remaining balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, my district is home to Barksdale Air Force Base, and I had a great meeting a couple weeks ago with Acting Assistant Secretary Oshiba there at the Pentagon to discuss our new entrance road and gate complex that's been in the works for some time at Barksdale. Just last week, my office was informed that the Air Force plans to award the contract for that project by the end of next month, May. Can you confirm that timeline for the contract award?
That's my understanding also.
Very good. Shifting gears quickly to the F-35 program, it's my understanding that over 10 years ago, the Department and Congress determined that a second engine for the F-35 was costly and unnecessary. But this year's budget, of course, requests nearly $300 million to recreate a second engine program at the expense of F-35 quantities, funds to modernize the current engine and NGAD propulsion. So what changes are driving that push for this second F-35 engine?
Congressman, it's not a second F-35 engine. It's a completely new and much improved F-35 engine, potentially. It's a technology that was in very early stages of development when I first saw it in 2010 that has matured fairly well. Offers the opportunity for on the order of 20-25% cost savings or mission range improvement. So it's a substantial improvement and would be a replacement for the current engine, not a second one. There's a over $6 billion, I think, development cost associated with getting that engine completely developed and into production. So we're looking at that. We're funding the development this year, the next increment, but it's going to have to compete in our budget for those resources going forward. But it would be a substantial improvement over the current capability.
And what would be the timeline to develop and test and integrate and field that?
We're a few years away from having a fully developed engine. There's a substantial development program ahead of us.
I guess the question we have is, wouldn't it make more sense to focus investment on the next generation air dominance program rather than drastically modify a fighter program that's already plagued by delays?
Well, the ATP engine would offer increased power, which we're going to need as we continue to modernize the F-35. The F-35 is going to be the cornerstone of our fleet. We're going to have, a very large inventory of F-35s. So the fuel savings that we could accomplish through that engine would be a significant payoff. So again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. There's some good operational reasons to do it. There are also some good reasons from the point of view of climate change to do it, and just from operational efficiency, energy efficiency to do it. But again, it's going to have to compete with other things in our budget going forward.
So in addition to the lower F-35 procurement, this year's budget proposes ending the F-15EX procurement at 80 aircraft. There's been some discussion about that today.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, it seems likely that some units around the country and overseas that operate under the older F-15C and D models are just not going to get replacement aircraft. Is that an accurate assessment? And if so, what's the plan for all those airmen?
We were talking about the fighter mix earlier, and we're also talking about other missions that are coming into existence, cyber missions, for example, information warfare missions. So it's not correct to think about this as a one-for-one replacement that has to happen. The older F-15Cs are going to have to come out of the inventory at some point, but we need to think about it much more broadly than just fighters for fighters. It's a bigger equation than that.
But the commitment is, or I guess the focus would be not to have idle airmen, right? They will have something to do, right? Yes.
That's our intention, yes.
Got it. Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Carvajal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Brief question to start to General Raymond in light of the upcoming NDAA, so I and others could better prepare. I wanted to ask, what is the status of the range of the future report required in Section 1610 of Fiscal Year 22 NDAA? I believe this is due at the end of this month. Just wanted to ask you.
Yeah, I've reviewed it, and I think we'll meet our timelines. It's been drafted.
Do you have any sense when it might come out?
It'll meet the timelines.
Oh, it will. Great. Thank you so much. I think my colleague, Representative Cajela, has already touched on the establishing of or standing up of a separate space National Guard component. I just want to associate myself with his comments, Secretary, so you're aware of my personal sentiments as well. Secretary Kendall, last week I had the privilege of welcoming Vice President Harris and General Raymond to my district for their visit to Vandenberg Space Force Base. Vice President Harris announced during her visit that the United States commits not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite ASAT missile testing, and that the United States seeks to establish this as a new international norm for responsible behavior in space. The Vice President also called on other nations to make similar commitments and to work together to establishing this as a norm. With this announcement and commitment, what are our next steps to make this an internationally adhered norm? And how are we engaging China and Russia on this issue?
That would not be a responsibility of the Department of the Air Force, although we'd support it. It would be a State Department-led, I would assume, initiative with defense in support again. I'm not aware of, but we can get for the record perhaps any existing plans. The National Space Council is very interested in this too, that the Vice President chairs. So I think there will be an effort to move this forward and try to get other nations to sign up, but I'm not intimately aware of what the exact plans are.
Thank you. Continuing on, Secretary Kendall, in February, the Army published its climate strategy outlining how the service intends to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Is the Air Force working on a similar strategy? And if so, when can we expect to see it published?
We have been working on a similar strategy, and there are elements of it which we are executing now. We're monitoring the Arctic carefully. We're working with our partners in that region. We're concerned about deterrence in that area, and we're concerned about our capabilities in that area. The initial draft of that strategy I looked at, and I wasn't satisfied with it, quite frankly. And so we're trying to do something which is more forceful and more action-oriented than the original draft was. I can't give you a date at this point in time, but I hope to have something published in the near future.
Thank you. And General Raymond, I just want to thank you for always being so responsive and attentive to the issues, concerns, needs, and challenges of Vandenberg Space Force Base. Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Green is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding the hearing. Of course, thanks to our witnesses. Thanks for your life of service to the country. The DoD and the Department of the Air Force are rightfully pivoting to the global war on terror, from the global war on terror to the current threat posed by Russia and China. However, I have some significant concerns about the vulnerabilities for divesting platforms. I'm sure you've heard it already today. That provide significant combat capability before the sustainable replacement is ready and fielded. And as I told General Milley during our recent defense-wide budget hearing, I'm specifically concerned about the loss of JSTARS and AWACS. The Biden administration seems to be removing critical instruments from our toolkit. The plan is to stop funding these critical capabilities now and simply hope for new and more lethal and cost-effective replacements to roll out seamlessly. This budget diverts already scarce defense dollars into searching for replacement systems, leaving an extensive capabilities gap while a land war rages in Europe. The divestiture of these critical systems is occurring, I think, far too rapidly, and it's time for Congress to adequately fund the transition from legacy systems to their replacements. And I think there's also a mechanism out there. I've met with Representative Whitman, who sits a little further up on the dais than I, and he advised me about a formerly created and still authorized Naval Strategic Deterrence Fund. It could be a mechanism where we can put extra dollars there to cover the legacy systems and our ramp up of new systems so that the DoD budget top line can work for those members of both the administration and the Congress who want to see that the main budget stays flatline, much like we did the OCO over the years of the war on terror. Does that make sense? Am I making sense on that, how we would use those funds? We've already talked about inflation and things like that. I won't go into that. What I really want to ask today is if we put a working group together and got some Democrats on board with this, and would you guys be interested in working with that group for how we might be able to use this Naval Strategic Deterrence Fund that, again, has already been authorized by Congress to address the potential of the legacy systems coming out too soon? Would y'all be interested in putting people to help us with this working group?
I think what you're referring to is a fund that essentially separately funded the strategic deterrence, so
Yes.
that it didn't have the effect that it has on our budget. In our case, we have fully funded in our budget request, and we'll continue to do so, the strategic deterrent. I think that's a position the administration has taken.
There's apparently a fund separate of DOD's budget. This is a fund that's separate of DOD budget, very much similar to the OCO. You'll recall we kind of abused that a little bit, stuck some stuff in the OCO in order to keep the budget flatline, the DOD budget flatline, and that helps people on both sides, particularly other parts of the country where being able to say we didn't, necessarily raise DOD's budget. There's the potential that we could keep legacy systems around a little longer, fund it through this. Your top line budget stays the same, and yet those systems stick around a little longer until the other systems are fully funded. And I'm just wondering if y'all are interested in that dialogue, and if you could loan us somebody with some ideas on that.
I'm going to have to decline for now. And the reason is that these ideas basically create a different way to count the money, but it's still the money. And we still have to spend what we have to spend on national security. You know, it's a fact of history that we made a big investment in the strategic deterrent decades ago, and then we lived off of that capital for a long time, and now we're having to recapitalize.
Sure, so I understand that comment, but what I want to be able to make sure, and what you all will be held very much accountable to, is the capability of our force. And as those legacy systems come down, that capabilities gap can't be there. And that's what I'm asking for you to work with members of both sides of the aisle to kind of think through what we can do in terms of making sure that those legacy systems are around long enough until the new stuff replacing that capability gets in the field.
We're open to new ideas always, but I think our budget request does accommodate a reasonable balance of current and future capabilities and fund the strategic deterrent. So I think we're asking for the money we need to do what we think is necessary.
You're asking for everything you need. There's nothing else you would need.
We have a balanced and I think a reasonable request that
Okay.
will implement the national defense.
Fair enough. We're going to continue the dialogue about it here, but we may have questions then in future testimony about it. Thank you both, and thanks for your service to our great country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McLean is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. I'm proud to note that Selfridge Air National Guard Base in my district is home to 21 A-10s aircraft on the 127th Fighter Wing. These uniquely capable aircraft have proven themselves time after time in every major conflict in the U.S. Has engaged in since the first Gulf War, saving countless lives while delivering battlefield-altering close air support. And in part, due to their high utilization, A-10 aircraft have not had their wings replaced previously and are rapidly beginning to time out on their original wings. We've talked about that. Wing replacement for this aircraft is essential. Indeed, about half of the aircraft on Selfridge right now requires new wings. I'm highly concerned that the President's FY23 budget request does not provide the funding for additional wing sets as notes that the Air Force has procured enough wings for only a fleet of 218. So it looks like in the budget, FY2022's budget was for 280 wing replacements. And then this year's budget, say that 3 times fast, then in this year's budget, it talks about replacing 260. There's enough for 260, yet it's only going to replace 218. So I guess what is the true A-10 divestment target for 2023? Is it 260 or is it 218?
It's 260, but in previous budget, we had funded 218 of the wing kits already, and we're on the path to fund more. I think that it's a balance between where we are today and where we're headed. But 218 is what we had in last year's budget for the wing kits, and then we're going down from 281 to 260 in this budget.
But we're only, of those 260 that we want to maintain, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this right, because the math isn't working in my brain. We want to keep 260 active, right?
In this fiscal year.
In this fiscal year.
FY23, excuse me.
Correct. Yet we only have money to keep 218 active. Am I reading that right?
218, it will get we funded 218 wing kits that will be put on 218 A-10.
But we have two, do we only have 218 that need replaced?
Depends on how many A-10s we keep over the FIDF. I mean, this is what balance of coming down from 281 to a lower number. And we don't want to do buy more wing kits than we're going to need if we're going to start retiring A-10s.
So we really only have 218 A-10s that are available to fly, or is it 260?
We'll have 260 because the they'll fly with their existing wings.
Right.
Okay,
They won't have the
so
wings
the
replaced.
difference is okay, they don't
Yeah.
need the wing replacement.
They still have life left on them.
They still have life left on. Okay. My final question is, what does the Air Force plan to do with the retired aircraft when it gets retired?
Typically, what we do with the aircraft is we take them out to our boneyard at Davis-Monthan, and we store them there. And then we can use them for parts, or in some cases, we'll bring them back into the fleet for certain airplanes. So potentially.
Do we ever foresee selling them to recoup some, maybe to our
In some-
allies?
in
Is
some
that
cases-
an option as well?
In some cases, we do that based on the airplane and based on the request of our allies and partners.
Okay, very good. Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Carl is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall, thank you for stopping by yesterday and chit-chatting with me. I appreciate your time. I know how valuable it truly is, so thank you. But I do want to talk about the possibility of the KCY not being brought up in a competitive situation coming up. You and I had this conversation. I promise you I wouldn't throw you under the bus, and I won't, but it is really a sore point. I'd like to point out a couple of things before I get you to do that. You know, competition, we both agreed, is a good thing. It truly is. But when you get a competition and someone wins a low bid, I think they should deliver that product at that price on that time frame. And on this plane, it is not there. We're behind schedule. I think now, according to my notes, we're told that these planes will be 100% ready by 2024. And I'm not holding you to that. I'm just reading my notes here. So 2024, but right now we're flying with a plane that can only refuel 78% of our fleet. But yet we are refueling in behind the LMXT in the Europeans, in the Europe countries at 100%. Now, I'm arguing the point, obviously, that we should open up the bid for the LMXT so they can be bid against this KCY aircraft. And I can't understand why the Air Force, I mean, they've already started, the Air Force has already started the propaganda. They've started throwing the little stories out, letting us know that they're not going to bid it out. They're not going to bid it out. But I go back to my same old country roots. Would you really buy a car knowing you could only drive it 78% of the time?
Thanks, Congressman, and enjoyed the conversation also. Thank you for that yesterday. And General Brown may want to help me with this, but the current situation is that the KC-46 can service about 85% of the types of aircraft that it has to service. The only things that we don't have that I'm aware of are the A-10 and I think certain C-130s. And there may be others as well. But the vast majority of our tankers, fighters, and bombers, it can provide fuel to. And we've moved far from where we were a year ago or so when we could only do the F-18. So we're getting to where we need to be on the KC-46. That said, if competition's the right thing to do, and I love competition, I'm all for it. It's the best tool we have to reduce cost. But we actually have to have a demand for the other aircraft that's being offered in this case, a requirement for it. And the Air Mobility Command is working on its requirements for the aircraft that would follow the current, contracted buy, basically, of KC-46. And I'm trying to be as transparent and honest about this as I can be. It is not as certain as it was a year ago, let's say, that we were going to do a competition. And I don't want people to have a misimpression about that. We have not made a final decision yet. I've had Lockheed in and talked to them. I'm aware of their design. I'm going to be asking a lot of questions before we make a final decision about this. So it's not done yet, but I'm just letting people know that the probability of it being a competition is diminished from what it was a year ago.
Well, it disturbs me when you see an aircraft company, quote unquote, win at lowest bid and they don't deliver it on time. Now I'm reading an article that's on Twitter now that Boeing has come out and said that they wish they would never bid Air Force One because there's $660 million in the hole. That's not the taxpayer's responsibility. We paid for a product and we want it delivered. I don't care. I do care that the companies lose money. Don't get me wrong. I think the process itself is where the real problem's at. The lowest bidder, gets it, make them deliver it. And that's what I'm talking about here. We got an aircraft that we can refuel from 100% of the time. This may say 2024, but what's it going to, we get to 2024, is it going to move to 2026? Is it going to move to 28? We have no way of knowing because this plane should have been delivered 100% when? In 2018? 2017?
It should have, the original production aircraft should have met our requirements, and they did not.
Okay, so that's
Bo-
5 or 6
Boeing
years
is operating
behind.
on a fixed price contract. They've lost $5 or $6 billion already.
Well, they've lost money, but we label that as upgrades, but the truth is, it's the design issues that they've losing money on. It was designed wrong. They don't have night vision. They couldn't refuel with the stick that they had, pardon my terminology. And I'm about to run out of time. But real quickly, I'd like to make sure you understand also the selection of Huntsville, the site for the Space Force, I think was right then, and I think it's right now. And I really would appreciate y'all looking very strongly and keeping that. With that said,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Speaker, thank you for your time. and
Mr.
thank you again, Mr.
Franklin
Kendall.
is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Kendall, I apologize in advance if you've touched on this because I think I heard you engaging with Mr. Banks as I was coming in the room about divestment. I have more questions about the divestment. As you're aware, in last year's NDAA, the Senate blocked the divestment of 42 A-10 aircraft. It's my understanding, and that's what I want to get your thoughts on, the inability to divest of those A-10s would potentially prohibit the bed down of F-35 squadrons at Tyndall. I don't know if those decisions were linked or not. But with a couple of questions regarding the A-10s, did the inability to divest those A-10s last year have implications on the Air Force's fifth generation fighter capability?
It has, and we're still trying to figure out how to react to that. The maintainers who were doing the A-10s that we had planned to retire were going to be retrained and go to F-35s. Okay. And now because they still have to do A-10, we're not able to do that. There are several hundred people that are affected by this, so we're trying to find another solution to that problem.
Okay. Well, what is the status currently of the bed down of the F-35 squadrons at Tyndall?
I think it's on hold until we can resolve this problem. Security, you have any?
Yeah, we're going to have to delay a little bit because it's about, if I have our numbers correct, it's about 950 maintainers that was in the plan from last year to make that transition. So we are, as the Secretary described, looking at some other options on how we harvest the 950 maintainers that would actually get this back on track.
And as was mentioned earlier, that's not an instant flip of the switch. Will those be A-10 trained personnel that will be switching over to the new platform, or?
It's a combination, and it's a matter of, as our airmen PCS and move, we'll have experience levels and we'll be able to move some of those airmen. Some of them will come from where they work on A-10, they may come from other airplanes. But it's being able to move those airmen around, but having the flexibility is the key part, to be able to have them available to transition from one aircraft to the other.
Roger that, thanks. Secretary Kendall, continuing on this divestment theme, this year's proposed budget calls for the divestment of 33 F-22s, which, as I think my math is right, about a sixth of the total F-22 fleet. We all know how important fifth-gen fighters are to our great power competition that we're trying to re-equip for, coming out of 20 years in the Gulf. But can you expand on the potential implications of this divestment of fifth-gen aircraft, which we don't have enough of already?
That's essentially an efficiency move for us. We're taking out the Block 20, the oldest F-22s. They're less combat capable and would not probably be employed against a high-end threat. It would cost prohibitively to upgrade them, about $50 million per aircraft. And they're used for training now. And what we can do is we can substitute fully combat capable aircraft and use them for training with the ability to deploy those aircraft if we needed to. So it's going to be an efficiency saving that will not significantly impact our combat capability.
Okay. But we're still re-winging Vietnam-era aircraft that clearly aren't going to play a role in a war against some of these potential adversaries. Okay, so that answers that question. Are there any other legacy aircraft divestments that could allow us to continue funding and flying these? And you're saying it's cost prohibitive. It's really not. If you had the money, you'd invest it somewhere else besides these aircraft. So there's nothing you could do software-wise or anything. The airframes themselves are just too far gone to make it worthwhile, even in a training capacity.
I'm supporting the budget that we requested. Quite frankly, though, if I had more money to spend in the Department of the Air Force, it might not go to airplanes at all. It might go to things like munitions, electronic warfare, and information security.
Well, it's been an age-old problem of trying to fight like you train like you fight. It's hard as a fifth generation fighter to go out and train. We don't want to use these frontline assets to train against one another and expend them in that sense. What role do you see, or do you see a greater role for using virtual and augmented reality on training ranges to try to avoid putting hours on these airframes that are so critical?
Well, we want to train our F-22 pilots on the same aircraft they actually would use in combat. So this will improve their training in that regard. But we do try to do a mix of simulators as well as live training to get the optimal mix from a cost-effectiveness point of view.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bice is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here this afternoon. We're now at afternoon. First of all, Secretary Kendall, I want to say thank you for the inclusion of the $30 million in the Air Force budget to acquire the needed real estate at Tinker Air Force Base for the forthcoming B-21 Depot Maintenance Campus. That's incredibly important to my district and certainly critical to national security, so I appreciate you including that. My question, as may be expected, has to do with the E3, and divestiture seems to be a hot topic in this hearing today. I want to talk about the proposed divestiture of the 15 E3 Center aircraft in the budget proposal. I was incredibly pleased to see that the official announcement that the E-7s would be the replacement aircraft for the E-3. However, there is a concern that I have as it relates to divesting those 15 aircraft before we ever even have a contract signed to move forward on the E-7. So my question is, Secretary Kendall or General Brown, what is the estimated cost savings associated with the divestiture of the E-3s on a per year and a per aircraft basis?
If I have the numbers correctly, I think by the end of the fit-up, we save $1 billion a year.
$1 billion?
Yeah. And it increments as you go out and you accumulate more savings over time.
Great.
But I think it gets to that. I'd like to confirm that for the record, but I believe that's about right. A little bit less than $1 billion.
Great. Can you tell me if the savings associated with the divestiture will be applied to the procurement of the E-7s? Will the savings from the E-3s be applied to the acquisition of the E-7s?
It isn't a direct one-for-one correlation, but you can look at it that way if you choose to. And if, in effect, the money that's saved goes into, we don't do a one-for-one swap of money that way.
But if I'm saving you $1 billion bucks,
net savings, and we try to make the investments that we need to do.
Okay. What can Congress do to move up the delivery of the E-7s? Currently, it is my understanding that we're looking at, if we were to sign a contract, we're looking at an FY27 delivery date. And if you're looking at divesting those 15 of the 31 aircraft, we don't have capabilities for quite some time. So what can we do to speed that up?
I would like to accelerate that delivery if possible. I'm not sure at this point it's possible. We have about $225 million, if I remember correctly, in the budget for R&D in 23 for the E-7. We're going to have to make some changes to the aircraft to meet our requirements. I am exploring options to try to accelerate those deliveries, because I'd like to do that if we can. I'm just not sure it's possible right now.
Can you elaborate on why you think that's not possible?
The modifications that might have to be made and the time it takes to do the engineering and implement those, and then where we are in the production line in terms of being able to get aircraft. I think we start production, if I remember correctly, in 25 and get delivery in 27. And so to accelerate that, there are some things that would have to happen to make that possible. But I'm not sure they can be done right now.
I want to quickly just say I had a great meeting with Colonel Coyle last week at Tinker Air Force Base to discuss the divestiture and maybe walk through some of the details of that. And I want to say that I appreciated his perspective and insight into what he's looking at and the challenges that he sees currently with this entry and why this E-7 procurement is important. But I am 100% for your deal. We need to speed it up, and whatever I can do to make that happen, I'm happy to work with the Air Force in making that a reality. I want to pivot quickly to the Retrained Skilled Veterans Act, which my colleague Blake Moore has filed. I've been working closely with him, and this legislation would make permanent the ability for retiring service members to pursue positions at the GS-13 level or below without having to comply with the 180-day cooling-off period. With significant workforce challenges that we're seeing across the nation today, I think the urgency of securing the permanence of this policy is very evident. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, could you discuss the current waiver of the 180-day rule and how it benefits the Department of Defense's workforce needs?
I'm not familiar with that issue, but I'm sympathetic to anything that increases our flexibility. we're finding difficulties in hiring, the length of time it takes and so on. We're not as competitive as we should be with the commercial world, with the outside market. So anything that relaxes some of those constraints would be of interest to me. A lot of these constraints are put in place to prevent abuse. I think abuses tend to be very rare, and the constraints are always present. And so I think we need to look at these much more carefully, and I'd be happy to have a conversation about that with you.
General, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the specific legislation, but I agree with the Secretary. The faster we can get talent on board, the better, because otherwise we might lose it if they have to wait too long.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Moore for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the gentlelady from Oklahoma, Ms. Bice, for asking my questions for me. Thank you. General Brown and Secretary Kendall, I want to continue to talk about the 180-day rule. A little concerned you're not familiar enough with the legislation. We will make sure that we communicate that directly to you, but many in your ranks are very familiar with it and very supportive of it. Broad support across the entire Air Force. So again, I hail from the 1st District of Utah, where we're an Air Force district. Second largest, Hill Air Force Base, second largest installation. The 388th, first operational wing of the F-35, and the newly named, which we're very excited about the new name, the Sentinel program, the ground-based strategic deterrent. Because of this, we're so focused on our depot work, and we want to be able to have the flexibility. Again, the 180-day rule is crucial to be able to make sure we have the workforce needs that we, as GS-13 and below in particular, that will reduce any potential issues or abuses that would ever come from something like this, and it helps us immediately hire and keep our workforce going. As you mentioned, you're not necessarily familiar with the legislation. Any other comments now that we have a little bit more time to just talk about, the need for this? I'll throw it to General Brown first. Making sure that, we want to have full support for this particular piece, and are you okay if we provide your office with detailed updates on this particular issue?
I'd be very interested in that. You're bringing back memories. In 1982, I was a captain in the Army, and over a weekend I came back to work as a GS-13. And I didn't have to wait 180 days. And I think it would have been great discouragement to me if I had to do that. So I'd be very interested in looking at this legislation.
Well, we provided, there's a waiver that's been in existence for a while. And we've had long enough to look at the data and say, this should be the status quo. We've got to we remove this bureaucratic piece and make this and change this into law. We keep making incremental inches forward every time we have an NDAA cycle. And we need to address that this year. We need to be data-driven individuals from our side, on the Congress side, from the DoD, and say, let's embrace this. Let's go. The unions are great with this. The workers want this. Our defense depots desperately need this type of workforce. We know that it's a shortage across our entire economy, but particularly with this. Let me jump over to the Depot Caucus. So I chair the Depot Caucus, and we recently held an event with the Army to provide them the opportunity to brief members on the Army, the OIB modernization plan. Many of my colleagues, particularly those of us with air logistic complexes, ALCs, are waiting for the Air Force's 5-year optimization plan, and was supposed to be submitted alongside the budget. Can we expect, Secretary Kendall, can we expect to see this soon? Could you preview its specific goals that are associated with FY23?
Yeah, overall, the 5-year plan is what's reflected in our 5-year development plan. I think we're working on a 20-year organic and industrial base plan as well. I don't have the specifics in my head, but I'd be happy to get with you and talk to you about that.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of work on the Army side. This is a win-win. This is a win. We have bipartisan members on the Depot Caucus from various districts with Army, Navy, Air Force bases, And we are really anxious from the Air Force side to be able to get the plan so we can get working on this and make sure that we can implement it. Lastly, General Brown, from my understanding, JASM and LRASM and the stand-in attack weapon can help the F-35 reach its full potential as a 5th-generation fighter. Can you please provide an update on the implementation of advanced weaponry for the F-35 with battle management capabilities needed to address increasing adversarial threats?
Sure, particularly on JASM and LRASM, because they're basically built from the same body. We're maxing out production in this particular budget, and that's an important aspect of the capability, not just the airplane, as I've said earlier, the weapons as well. And then we're also putting money into our RTD&E for stand-in attack weapon to provide that capability for the F-35 as well. So those are two key. I'd also highlight JADM. The Joint Air Tactical Missile is another aspect that we want to continue to develop, give us the air-to-air range as well.
Excellent. Thank you both. We'll follow up on the 180-day legislation. Make sure you have clear copies of it.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Fallon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. General Brown, how are you? Thank you all for coming. I wanted to start real quickly on, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just general on a personal level. As an Air Force veteran myself, very proud. I love all 4 branches of the service. I just love the Air Force a little bit more. I was dismayed last year when I believed it was politically driven, that some were alleging that there was a major problem with extremism in the military. I mean, you're always going to have some bad apples, but I took that as an affront, because there's a difference between truth and then deliberate fiction. And that's why, I just remember my experience. And the first thing they did when we got on station was, this is a meritocracy. We don't put up, and we have zero tolerance for any kind of bigotry, any kind of discrimination. And we loved that. It's America. And the Air Force and the military have been on the cutting edge. I think in advance and further than our society had gotten. I think have been leading. That was 30 years ago. I don't know, but I suspect it's getting even better. So one of the questions that we asked each branch was, because I want to deal with truth and data, how many folks have been separated in the last fiscal year, due to extremist activities? And some of the other branches got us an answer. The Air Force hewed and hawed, and they didn't give us an answer, but they finally said, well, we don't track that. So I was just wondering if you track it now, and if you don't, I would respectfully ask if you should, because I just want to deal with truth. So if somebody says that again, I can say, what are you talking about? Of the 330,000 active, it was 4 or 5, and that's not it's an issue. One's too many, but it's not a serious issue. So I just wanted you to comment on that real quickly. Thank you.
I appreciate you asking the question. We'll have to get back to you. I know of a couple, personally, I know of that have been removed from the service based on extremism or extreme activities. But what I will tell you, a good majority of airmen all live up to our core values.
Amen.
And that's exactly what it's all about. And it's the aspect of, we don't want any one of our airmen, or our guardians for that matter, or any other service member to feel like they're being either harassed, discriminated, or live in an environment they can't reach their full potential. And
That's
so,
not cohesion, and we want them out. We want the bad apples out. I remember an instance, it was more sexism, but they kicked his butt out, within a few weeks after he graduated, basically while he was in tech training. So, but if just tracking it, then we can, if some yo-yos here, waste your time with something like that, we can have a ready answer. And if it is an issue, then we'll address it. I just want to move forward. So, General, with recruiting and retention, our office asked on the 13th of April this month, what the Air Force recruiting was for, the basic training graduates and, Air Force officers commissioned. And we haven't got an answer yet. So I'd love to have that answer at some point. It's been 2 weeks. But I did notice that FY22 we had 329,000 in strength, and then FY23 planning on 323. So it's a reduction of almost 2%. And when you think about nuclearized Iran, of course the largest land invasion we've seen in Europe in 70 years, and a resurgent China, what's the rationale and the reasoning behind the reduction?
that in-strength reduction is tied to force structure. And so one of the things we're doing is actually making sure we're aligning what we're doing from a force structure standpoint with our in-strength. So those are tied together.
Okay.
And,
thank you. Secretary Kendall, with pilots, I think we have, it's 12,451, and our strength is 14. We want 14,101, so there's a delta there. What are our plans to remedy that?
Yeah, we're looking at things that increase the efficiency of the pipeline to produce pilots, and we're trying to recruit more and bring them in. You know, we don't have an operational shortage of pilots and flying units. What we have is a shortage of rated people in staff jobs generally. So it's not really affecting readiness that much. But we are making incremental progress. I think the pilot shortfall fell by about 300 this past year. So we're making some progress on that, and we're doing a number of things to address that problem.
Yeah, because I remember my PAS when I was in ROTC telling me in the 70s after Vietnam, they let a bunch of pilots go, and then a couple years later they had a shortage. And then we were seeing that in the early 90s where they were banking pilots and letting folks go, and then what happened? And he predicted it too. He said, you're going to have a shortage, and we did. I just don't want to see that. I want to learn from that history.
We're having some difficulties with recruiting in general, not just pilots right now.
Yeah, and that's why I asked for those about, I'm worried about that because I'm hearing that from people at Lackland. I'm hearing that from people in some of the bases with the Army as well. General, the RC-135 Rivet Joint Platform, we make that in Greenville, Texas. It's in the district that I currently represent, but won't come January. But I just wanted, I know that we're in an unclassified setting, but I was wondering if you could comment on the contributions to our efforts to support Ukraine and our NATO allies vis-a-vis this platform.
Well, it's not just the RC-135, it's all the other ISR platforms that come together to help provide information, not only to ourselves to have a good sense of what's going on, but to support Ukraine in their operations as well. So the RC-135, having been an air component commander a couple of times and having to operate personally for me and the things I have to do as an air component commander, provides some pretty great capability to give us a good sense of what's going on within whatever environment we're monitoring.
Members' time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Waltz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for sticking with us today. I certainly think the American people deserve our close attention here. I'm struggling, and Mr. Kendall, thank you for the call. Thank you all for the engagement. I'm still struggling to figure out how this budget builds and maintains an Air Force that can meet the National Defense Strategy. How it, Mr. Kendall, we've received some briefings from you. Thank you. We've received the overmatch brief. That essentially, if we buy into the notion that the Chinese Communist Party believes it has match or overmatch in the next 5 years, coupled with still deterring Russia, coupled with Iran, North Korea, and keeping a lid on global terrorism, how this budget gets us there. I mean, I'll be candid. I think we need to raise the DoD top line. We're going backwards with inflation. The comptroller used a 4% figure. We're sitting at 8%. And therefore, raise the Air Force top line to be able to both accelerate modernization and enable legacy retirement recapitalization by reprogramming recapitalization that preserves the combat capability. Because we don't know if and when the next Ukraine is going to happen or the next Taiwan or what have you. And I'm, as you've heard from many members, very concerned about this dip that we constantly seem to be in as we divest to invest. Secretary Kendall, I'm particularly concerned about readiness. We talked about it briefly. The Air Force's budget continues to take risk, particularly in weapon system sustainment accounts. It's funded at 83% of the requirement. If you add in your unfunded priority list requests at about $500 million, that raises it to 87%, but we're still trading near-term readiness for long-term modernization. We're still in that dip. And I can't figure out why you aren't coming to us and saying, this is what I truly need, and here's the risks that we're taking. But yesterday when we spoke, you thought it was adequate. You thought it gets the job done. And I think we have a teachable moment right now in Ukraine on how you can have the shiniest, newest, most modern toys, but if they're not ready, if they're not sustained, then at least Russia right now is feeling that pain, and I don't ever want to see us feel it. So talk to me about readiness, particularly when our premier fighter, the Joint Strike Fighter, set aside the weapons readiness, isn't even sitting at 75%. And I don't see a path to get there.
General Brown and Commandant Berger wrote a great article on readiness and pointed out that you have to think about readiness much more broadly than we do traditionally. I have a card here with all the current availability rates for our aircraft, which aren't where I'd like them to be. But the real question is ready for what and when. And the threats are getting worse over time. There's no question about that. We do believe we have adequately ready forces today to deal with anything the National Defense Strategy would ask us to do today, support combatant commanders.
Do you believe we have it 5 years from now? against an
When
increasingly
I
lethal,
said
as
in my
we've been
opening
repeatedly
statement-
briefed.
When I said in my opening statement, we would have to make tough choices. This is partly what I was talking about. We're going to have to transition from the force we have to one that's going to be adequate to deal with the future threat. And the pacing threat is China. And it's not China everywhere in the world. It's China in the vicinity.
But I don't want to pace. I want to outmatch.
I agree with you completely.
And I don't see that, and I just don't see us getting there in that budget. So I look forward to, perhaps, I'll have some follow-on questions for the record of how we
that'd be
get
fine.
there. And if we were to give you more to invest, I mean, we're out of time. And what we're investing in today, if you believe that we may potentially be in a conflict 5 years from now, this is it. I mean, I believe. But I look forward to working with you there.
Again, we have to be concerned not just with now, not just with 5 years, but 10 and 15 years, right? So we've got to worry about all these time frames.
I feel like we're in 1936, seeing what's coming in terms of a potential conflict. And I agree with you. We have to think past it, but we have to win the next potential conflict.
My opening quote was from 1940, which is another time frame of interest.
Just in the time I have remaining, General Raymond, thank you for our conversations about a potential space reserve fleet to match the civil air fleet construct. I want you to have those capabilities in a time of war to grab those civilian capabilities. I look forward to working with you on that. And then finally, General Brown, when will we get, the GAO has been making recommendations for 8 years on F-35. And most recently, they asked for a report on the reports. When will we get that report on F-35 sustainment? Because I just think frankly, it's broken in many ways. And we need to be open-eyed and honest about it, particularly as we head into NGAD. But when will we get that?
I'll have to get you an update on where we are. But to your point, though, we want to make sure that we're actually responding to those and taking the recommendations from the GAO seriously, which we are.
They've had some sitting on the table for 8 years.
Members'
Some of the
time has expired.
recommendations. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr.
No more members with questions today. So Secretary Kendall, General Brown, General Raymond, this committee thanks you for appearing before us today and for your leadership of the over 500,000 Air Force active duty, Air Force Reserve, and Air National Guard members and their families who each and every day dedicate their lives in service to this nation and the greatest Air Force in the history of the world. And with that, the Committee on Armed Services is adjourned.